Chapter 21. Suspense. It was late into the night when she at last reached the Fisherman's Rest. She had done the whole journey in less than 8 hours, thanks to innumerable changes of horses at the various coaching stations, for which she always paid lavishly, thus obtaining the very best and swiftest that could be had. Her coachman, too, had been indefatigable. The promise of special and rich reward had no doubt helped to keep him up, and he had literally burned the ground beneath his mistress' coach wheels. The arrival of Lady Blakeney in the middle of the night caused a considerable flutter at the Fisherman's Rest. Sally jumped hastily out of bed, and Mr. Jellyband was at great pains how to make his important guest comfortable. Both these good folk were far too well drilled in the manners appertaining to innkeepers to exhibit the slightest surprise at Lady Blakeney's arrival, alone, at this extraordinary hour. No doubt they thought all the more, but Marguerite was far too absorbed in the importance, the deadly earnestness, of her journey, to stop and ponder over trifles of that sort. The coffee-room, the scene lately of the dastardly outrage on 2 English gentlemen, was quite deserted. Mr. Jellyband hastily relit the lamp, rekindled a cheerful bit of fire in the great hearth, and then wheeled a comfortable chair by it, into which Marguerite gratefully sank. "Will your ladyship stay the night?" asked pretty Miss Sally, who was already busy laying a snow-white cloth on the table, preparatory to providing a simple supper for her ladyship. "No, not the whole night," replied Marguerite. "At any rate, I shall not want any room but this, if I can have it to myself for an hour or two." "It is at your ladyship's service," said honest Jellyband, whose rubicund face was set in its tightest folds, lest it should betray before it the quality, that boundless astonishment which the worthy fellow had begun to feel. "I shall be crossing over at the first turn of the tide," said Marguerite, "and in the first schooner I can get. But my coachman and men will stay the night and probably several days longer, so I hope you will make them comfortable." "Yes, my lady, I'll look after them. Shall Sally bring your ladyship some supper?" "Yes, please. Put something cold on the table, and as soon as Sir Andrew Ffoulkes comes, show him in here." "Yes, my lady." Honest Jellyband's face now expressed distress in spite of himself. He had great regard for Sir Percy Blakeney, and did not like to see his lady running away with young Sir Andrew. Of course, it was no business of his, and Mr. Jellyband was no gossip. Still, in his heart, he recollected that her ladyship was after all only one of them foreigners. What wonder that she was immoral like the rest of them? "Don't sit up, honest Jellyband," continued Marguerite kindly, "nor you either, Mistress Sally. Sir Andrew may be late." Jellyband was only too willing that Sally should go to bed. He was beginning not to like these goings-on at all. Still, Lady Blakeney would pay handsomely for the accommodation, and it certainly was no business of his. Sally arranged a simple supper of cold meat, wine, and fruit on the table, then with a respectful curtsy she retired, wondering in her little mind why her ladyship looked so serious, when she was about to elope with her gallant. Then commenced a period of weary waiting for Marguerite. She knew that Sir Andrew, who would have to provide himself with clothes befitting a lackey, could not possibly reach Dover for at least a couple of hours. He was a splendid horseman, of course, and would make light in such an emergency of the 70-odd miles between London and Dover. He would, too, literally burn the ground beneath his horse's hoofs, but he might not always get very good remounts, and in any case, he could not have started from London until at least an hour after she did. She had seen nothing of Chauvelin on the road. Her coachman, whom she questioned, had not seen anyone answering the description his mistress gave him of the wizened figure of the little Frenchman. Evidently, therefore, he had been ahead of her all the time. She had not dared to question the people at the various inns, where they had stopped to change horses. She feared that Chauvelin had spies all along the route, who might overhear her questions, then outdistance her and warn her enemy of her approach. Now she wondered at what inn he might be stopping, or whether he had had the good luck of chartering a vessel already, and was now himself on the way to France. That thought gripped her at the heart as with an iron vice. If indeed she should be too late already. The loneliness of the room overwhelmed her. Everything within was so horribly still. The ticking of the grandfather's clock, dreadfully slow and measured, was the only sound which broke this awful loneliness. Marguerite had need of all her energy, all her steadfastness of purpose, to keep up her courage through this weary midnight waiting. Everyone else in the house but herself must have been asleep. She had heard Sally go upstairs. Mr. Jellyband had gone to see to her coachman and men, and then had returned and taken up a position under the porch outside, just where Marguerite had first met Chauvelin about a week ago. He evidently meant to wait up for Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, but was soon overcome by sweet slumbers, for presently, in addition to the slow ticking of the clock, Marguerite could hear the monotonous and dulcet tones of the worthy fellow's breathing. For some time now she had realized that the beautiful warm October's day, so happily begun, had turned into a rough and cold night. She had felt very chilly and was glad of the cheerful blaze in the hearth, but gradually as time wore on, the weather became more rough, and the sound of the great breakers against the Admiralty Pier, though some distance from the inn, came to her as the noise of muffled thunder. The wind was becoming boisterous, rattling the leaded windows and the massive doors of the old-fashioned house. It shook the trees outside and roared down the vast chimney. Marguerite wondered if the wind would be favorable for her journey. She had no fear of the storm, and would have braved worse risks sooner than delay the crossing by an hour. A sudden commotion outside roused her from her meditations. Evidently it was Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, just arrived in mad haste, for she heard his horse's hoofs thundering on the flagstones outside, then Mr. Jellyband's sleepy, yet cheerful tones bidding him welcome. For a moment, then, the awkwardness of her position struck Marguerite. Alone at this hour, in a place where she was well known, and having made an assignation with a young cavalier equally well known, and who arrives in disguise. What food for gossip to those mischievously inclined. The idea struck Marguerite chiefly from its humorous side. There was such quaint contrast between the seriousness of her errand, and the construction which would naturally be put on her actions by honest Mr. Jellyband, that, for the first time since many hours, a little smile began playing round the corners of her childlike mouth, and when, presently, Sir Andrew, almost unrecognizable in his lackey-like garb, entered the coffee-room, she was able to greet him with quite a merry laugh. "Faith, Monsieur my lackey," she said, "I am satisfied with your appearance." Mr. Jellyband had followed Sir Andrew, looking strangely perplexed. The young gallant's disguise had confirmed his worst suspicions. Without a smile upon his jovial face, he drew the cork from the bottle of wine, set the chairs ready, and prepared to wait. "Thanks, honest friend," said Marguerite, who was still smiling at the thought of what the worthy fellow must be thinking at that very moment. "We shall require nothing more, and here's for all the trouble you have been put to on our account." She handed 2 or 3 gold pieces to Jellyband, who took them respectfully and with becoming gratitude. "Stay, Lady Blakeney," interposed Sir Andrew as Jellyband was about to retire. "I am afraid we shall require something more of my friend Jelly's hospitality. I am sorry to say we cannot cross over tonight." "Not cross over tonight?" she repeated in amazement. "But we must, Sir Andrew, we must. There can be no question of cannot, and whatever it may cost, we must get a vessel tonight." But the young man shook his head sadly. "I am afraid it is not a question of cost, Lady Blakeney. There is a nasty storm blowing from France, the wind is dead against us, we cannot possibly sail until it has changed." Marguerite became deadly pale. She had not foreseen this. Nature herself was playing her a horrible, cruel trick. Percy was in danger, and she could not go to him, because the wind happened to blow from the coast of France. "But we must go, we must," she repeated with strange, persistent energy. "You know we must go, can't you find a way?" "I have been down to the shore already," he said, "and had a talk to 1 or 2 skippers. It is quite impossible to set sail tonight, so every sailor assured me. No one," he added, looking significantly at Marguerite, "no one could possibly put out of Dover tonight." Marguerite at once understood what he meant. No one included Chauvelin as well as herself. She nodded pleasantly to Jellyband. "Well then I must resign myself," she said to him. "Have you a room for me?" "Oh yes, your ladyship. A nice, bright, airy room. I'll see to it at once. And there is another one for Sir Andrew, both quite ready." "That's brave now, mine honest Jelly," said Sir Andrew gaily, and clapping his worthy host vigorously on the back. "You unlock both those rooms and leave our candles here on the dresser. I vow you are dead with sleep, and her ladyship must have some supper before she retires. There, have no fear, friend of the rueful countenance, her ladyship's visit, though at this unusual hour, is a great honour to thy house, and Sir Percy Blakeney will reward thee doubly, if thou sayest well to her privacy and comfort." Sir Andrew had no doubt guessed the many conflicting doubts and fears which raged in honest Jellyband's head, and as he was a gallant gentleman, he tried by this brave hint to allay some of the worthy innkeeper's suspicions. He had the satisfaction of seeing that he had partially succeeded. Jellyband's rubicund countenance brightened somewhat at mention of Sir Percy's name. "I'll go and see to it at once, sir," he said with alacrity, and with less frigidity in his manner. "Has her ladyship everything she wants for supper?" "Everything, thanks, honest friend, and as I am famished and dead with fatigue, I pray you see to the rooms." "Now tell me," she said eagerly as soon as Jellyband had gone from the room, "tell me all your news." "There is nothing else much to tell you, Lady Blakeney," replied the young man. "The storm makes it quite impossible for any vessel to put out of Dover this tide. But what seemed to you at first a terrible calamity is really a blessing in disguise. If we cannot cross over to France tonight, Chauvelin is in the same quandary. He may have left before the storm broke out." "God grant he may," said Sir Andrew merrily, "for very likely then he'll have been driven out of his course. Who knows? He may now even be lying at the bottom of the sea, for there is a furious storm raging, and it will fare ill with all small craft which happen to be out. But I fear me we cannot build our hopes upon the shipwreck of that cunning devil, and of all his murderous plans. The sailors I spoke to all assured me that no schooner had put out of Dover for several hours. On the other hand, I ascertained that a stranger had arrived by coach this afternoon, and had, like myself, made some inquiries about crossing over to France." "Then Chauvelin is still in Dover?" "Undoubtedly. Shall I go waylay him and run my sword through him? That were indeed the quickest way out of the difficulty." "Nay, Sir Andrew, do not jest. Alas, I have often since last night caught myself wishing for that fiend's death. But what you suggest is impossible. The laws of this country do not permit of murder. It is only in our beautiful France that wholesale slaughter is done lawfully, in the name of liberty and of brotherly love." Sir Andrew had persuaded her to sit down to the table, to partake of some supper and to drink a little wine. This enforced rest of at least 12 hours, until the next tide, was sure to be terribly difficult to bear in the state of intense excitement in which she was. Obedient in these small matters like a child, Marguerite tried to eat and drink. Sir Andrew, with that profound sympathy born in all those who are in love, made her almost happy by talking to her about her husband. He recounted to her some of the daring escapes the brave Scarlet Pimpernel had contrived for the poor French fugitives, whom a relentless and bloody revolution was driving out of their country. He made her eyes glow with enthusiasm by telling her of his bravery, his ingenuity, his resourcefulness, when it meant snatching the lives of men, women, and even children from beneath the very edge of that murderous, ever-ready guillotine. He even made her smile quite merrily by telling her of the Scarlet Pimpernel's quaint and many disguises, through which he had baffled the strictest watch set against him at the barricades of Paris. This last time, the escape of the Comtesse de Tournay and her children had been a veritable masterpiece. Blakeney, disguised as a hideous old market woman, in filthy cap and straggling grey locks, was a sight fit to make the gods laugh. Marguerite laughed heartily as Sir Andrew tried to describe Blakeney's appearance, whose gravest difficulty always consisted in his great height, which in France made disguise doubly difficult. Thus an hour wore on. There were many more to spend in enforced inactivity in Dover. Marguerite rose from the table with an impatient sigh. She looked forward with dread to the night in the bed upstairs, with terribly anxious thoughts to keep her company, and the howling of the storm to help chase sleep away. She wondered where Percy was now. The Daydream was a strong, well-built, sea-going yacht. Sir Andrew had expressed the opinion that no doubt she had got in the lee of the wind before the storm broke out, or else perhaps had not ventured into the open at all, but was lying quietly at Gravesend. Briggs was an expert skipper, and Sir Percy handled a schooner as well as any master mariner. There was no danger for them from the storm. It was long past midnight when at last Marguerite retired to rest. As she had feared, sleep sedulously avoided her eyes. Her thoughts were of the blackest during these long weary hours, whilst that incessant storm raged which was keeping her away from Percy. The sound of the distant breakers made her heart ache with melancholy. She was in the mood when the sea has a saddening effect upon the nerves. It is only when we are very happy that we can bear to gaze merrily upon the vast and limitless expanse of water, rolling on and on with such persistent, irritating monotony, to the accompaniment of our thoughts, whether grave or gay. When they are gay, the waves echo their gaiety, but when they are sad, then every breaker as it rolls seems to bring additional sadness, and to speak to us of hopelessness and of the pettiness of all our joys. Chapter 22. Calais. The weariest nights, the longest days, sooner or later must perforce come to an end. Marguerite had spent over 15 hours in such acute mental torture as well nigh drove her crazy. After a sleepless night, she rose early, wild with excitement, dying to start on her journey, terrified lest further obstacles lay in her way. She rose before anyone else in the house was astir, so frightened was she, lest she should miss the one golden opportunity of making a start. When she came downstairs, she found Sir Andrew Ffoulkes sitting in the coffee-room. He had been out half an hour earlier, and had gone to the Admiralty Pier, only to find that neither the French packet nor any privately chartered vessel could put out of Dover yet. The storm was then at its fullest, and the tide was on the turn. If the wind did not abate or change, they would perforce have to wait another 10 or 12 hours until the next tide, before a start could be made. And the storm had not abated, the wind had not changed, and the tide was rapidly drawing out. Marguerite felt the sickness of despair when she heard this melancholy news. Only the most firm resolution kept her from totally breaking down, and thus adding to the young man's anxiety, which evidently had become very keen. Though he tried to disguise it, Marguerite could see that Sir Andrew was just as anxious as she was to reach his comrade and friend. This enforced inactivity was terrible to them both. How they spent that wearisome day at Dover, Marguerite could never afterwards say. She was in terror of showing herself, lest Chauvelin's spies happened to be about, so she had a private sitting room, and she and Sir Andrew sat there hour after hour trying to take at long intervals some perfunctory meals, which little Sally would bring them, with nothing to do but to think, to conjecture, and only occasionally to hope. The storm had abated just too late. The tide was by then too far out to allow a vessel to put off to sea. The wind had changed and was settling down to a comfortable northwesterly breeze, a veritable godsend for a speedy passage across to France. And there those two waited, wondering if the hour would ever come when they could finally make a start. There had been one happy interval in this long weary day, and that was when Sir Andrew went down once again to the pier, and presently came back to tell Marguerite that he had chartered a quick schooner, whose skipper was ready to put to sea the moment the tide was favorable. From that moment the hours seemed less wearisome, there was less hopelessness in the waiting, and at last at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Marguerite, closely veiled and followed by Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, who, in the guise of her lackey, was carrying a number of impedimenta, found her way down to the pier. Once on board, the keen, fresh sea air revived her. The breeze was just strong enough to nicely swell the sails of the foam crest, as she cut her way merrily towards the open. The sunset was glorious after the storm, and Marguerite, as she watched the white cliffs of Dover gradually disappearing from view, felt more at peace and once more almost hopeful. Sir Andrew was full of kind attentions, and she felt how lucky she had been to have him by her side in this, her great trouble. Gradually the grey coast of France began to emerge from the fast-gathering evening mists. 1 or 2 lights could be seen flickering, and the spires of several churches to rise out of the surrounding haze. Half an hour later Marguerite had landed upon French shore. She was back in that country where at this very moment men slaughtered their fellow creatures by the hundreds, and sent innocent women and children in thousands to the block. The very aspect of the country and its people, even in this remote seacoast town, spoke of that seething revolution, 300 miles away in beautiful Paris, now rendered hideous by the constant flow of the blood of her noblest sons, by the wailing of the widows, and the cries of fatherless children. The men all wore red caps, in various stages of cleanliness, but all with the tricolor cockade pinned on the left-hand side. Marguerite noticed with a shudder that, instead of the laughing, merry countenance habitual to her own countrymen, their faces now invariably wore a look of sly distrust. Every man nowadays was a spy upon his fellows. The most innocent word uttered in jest might at any time be brought up as a proof of aristocratic tendencies, or of treachery against the people. Even the women went about with a curious look of fear and of hate lurking in their brown eyes, and all watched Marguerite as she stepped on shore, followed by Sir Andrew, and murmured as she passed along, "Sacres aristos," or else "Sacres anglais." Otherwise their presence excited no further comment. Calais, even in those days, was in constant business communication with England, and English merchants were often to be seen on this coast. It was well known that in view of the heavy duties in England, a vast deal of French wines and brandies were smuggled across. This pleased the French bourgeois immensely. He liked to see the English government and the English king, both of whom he hated, cheated out of their revenues, and an English smuggler was always a welcome guest at the tumble-down taverns of Calais and Boulogne. So, perhaps, as Sir Andrew gradually directed Marguerite through the tortuous streets of Calais, many of the population, who turned with an oath to look at the strangers clad in the English fashion, thought that they were bent on purchasing dutiable articles for their own fog-ridden country, and gave them no more than a passing thought. Marguerite, however, wondered how her husband's tall, massive figure could have passed through Calais unobserved. She marveled what disguise he assumed to do his noble work without exciting too much attention. Without exchanging more than a few words, Sir Andrew was leading her right across the town, to the other side from that where they had landed, and on the way towards Cap Gris-Nez. The streets were narrow, tortuous, and mostly evil-smelling, with a mixture of stale fish and damp cellar odors. There had been heavy rain here during the storm last night, and sometimes Marguerite sank ankle-deep in the mud, for the roads were not lighted save by the occasional glimmer from a lamp inside a house. But she did not heed any of these petty discomforts. "We may meet Blakeney at the Chat Gris," Sir Andrew had said when they landed, and she was walking as if on a carpet of rose leaves, for she was going to meet him almost at once. At last they reached their destination. Sir Andrew evidently knew the road, for he had walked unerringly in the dark, and had not asked his way from anyone. It was too dark then for Marguerite to notice the outside aspect of this house. The Chat Gris, as Sir Andrew had called it, was evidently a small wayside inn on the outskirts of Calais, and on the way to Gris. It lay some little distance from the coast, for the sound of the sea seemed to come from afar. Sir Andrew knocked at the door with the knob of his cane, and from within Marguerite heard a sort of grunt and the muttering of a number of oaths. Sir Andrew knocked again, this time more peremptorily. More oaths were heard, and then shuffling steps seemed to draw near the door. Presently this was thrown open, and Marguerite found herself on the threshold of the most dilapidated, most squalid room she had ever seen in all her life. The paper, such as it was hanging from the walls in strips. There did not seem to be a single piece of furniture in the room that could, by the wildest stretch of imagination, be called whole. Most of the chairs had broken backs, others had no seats to them. One corner of the table was propped up with a bundle of faggots, there where the fourth leg had been broken. In one corner of the room there was a huge hearth, over which hung a stockpot, with a not altogether unpalatable odor of hot soup emanating therefrom. On one side of the room, high up in the wall, there was a species of loft, before which hung a tattered blue and white checked curtain. A rickety set of steps led up to this loft. On the great bare walls, with their colorless paper, all stained with varied filth, there were chalked up at intervals in great bold characters the words, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The whole of this sordid abode was dimly lighted by an evil-smelling oil lamp, which hung from the rickety rafters of the ceiling. It all looked so horribly squalid, so dirty and uninviting, that Marguerite hardly dared to cross the threshold. Sir Andrew, however, had stepped unhesitatingly forward. "English travelers, citoyen," he said boldly and speaking in French. The individual who had come to the door in response to Sir Andrew's knock, and who, presumably, was the owner of this squalid abode, was an elderly, heavily built peasant, dressed in a dirty blue blouse, heavy sabots, from which wisps of straw protruded all round, shabby blue trousers, and the inevitable red cap with the tricolour cockade, that proclaimed his momentary political views. He carried a short wooden pipe, from which the odor of rank tobacco emanated. He looked with some suspicion and a great deal of contempt at the two travelers, muttered, "Sacres Anglais," and spat upon the ground to further show his independence of spirit, but nevertheless he stood aside to let them enter, no doubt well aware that these same Sacres Anglais always had well-filled purses. "Oh, Lud," said Marguerite as she advanced into the room, holding her handkerchief to her dainty nose, "what a dreadful hole! Are you sure this is the place?" "Aye, 'tis the place sure enough," replied the young man as, with his lace-edged, fashionable handkerchief, he dusted a chair for Marguerite to sit on, "but I vow I never saw a more villainous hole." "Faith," she said, looking round with some curiosity and a great deal of horror at the dilapidated walls, the broken chairs, the rickety table, "it certainly does not look inviting." The landlord of the Chat Gris, by name Brogard, had taken no further notice of his guests. He concluded that presently they would order supper, and in the meanwhile it was not for a free citizen to show deference or even courtesy to anyone, however smartly they might be dressed. By the hearth sat a huddled-up figure clad, seemingly, mostly in rags. That figure was apparently a woman, although even that would have been hard to distinguish except for the cap, which had once been white, and for what looked like the semblance of a petticoat. She was sitting mumbling to herself, and from time to time stirring the brew in her stockpot. "Hey, my friend," said Sir Andrew at last, "we should like some supper. The citoyen there," he added, pointing to the huddled-up bundle of rags by the hearth, "is concocting some delicious soup, I'll warrant, and my mistress has not tasted food for several hours." It took Brogard some few moments to consider the question. A free citizen does not respond too readily to the wishes of those who happen to require something of him. "Sacres aristos," he murmured and once more spat upon the ground. Then he went very slowly up to a dresser which stood in a corner of the room. From this he took an old pewter soup tureen and slowly, and without a word, he handed it to his better half, who, in the same silence, began filling the tureen with the soup out of her stockpot. Marguerite had watched all these preparations with absolute horror. Were it not for the earnestness of her purpose, she would incontinently have fled from this abode of dirt and evil smells. "Faith, our host and hostess are not cheerful people," said Sir Andrew, seeing the look of horror on Marguerite's face. "I would I could offer you a more hearty and more appetizing meal, but I think you will find the soup eatable and the wine good, These people wallow in dirt but live well as a rule. Nay, I pray you, Sir Andrew, she said gently, be not anxious about me. My mind is scarce inclined to dwell on thoughts of supper. Brogard was slowly pursuing his gruesome preparations. He had placed a couple of spoons, also 2 glasses on the table, both of which Sir Andrew took the precaution of wiping carefully. Brogard had also produced a bottle of wine and some bread, and Marguerite made an effort to draw her chair to the table and to make some pretense at eating. Sir Andrew, as befitting his role of lackey, stood behind her chair. Nay, madam, I pray you, he said, seeing that Marguerite seemed quite unable to eat, I beg of you to try and swallow some food. Remember you have need of all your strength. The soup certainly was not bad. It smelt and tasted good. Marguerite might have enjoyed it but for the horrible surroundings. She broke the bread, however, and drank some of the wine. Nay, Sir Andrew, she said, I do not like to see you standing. You have need of food just as much as I have. This creature will only think that I am an eccentric Englishwoman eloping with her lackey, if you'll sit down and partake of this semblance of supper beside me. Indeed, Brogard, having placed what was strictly necessary upon the table, seemed not to trouble himself any further about his guests. The mere Brogard had quietly shuffled out of the room, and the man stood and lounged about, smoking his evil-smelling pipe, sometimes under Marguerite's very nose, as any freeborn citizen who was anybody's equal should do. Confound the brute, said Sir Andrew with native British wrath as Brogard leant up against the table, smoking and looking down superciliously at these 2 sackers anglais. In heaven's name, man, admonished Marguerite hurriedly, seeing that Sir Andrew, with British-born instinct, was ominously clenching his fist, remember that you are in France, and that in this year of grace this is the temper of the people. I'd like to scrag the brute, muttered Sir Andrew savagely. He had taken Marguerite's advice and sat next to her at table, and they were both making noble efforts to deceive one another, by pretending to eat and drink. I pray you, said Marguerite, keep the creature in a good temper, so that he may answer the questions we must put to him. I'll do my best, but begad, I'd sooner scrag him than question him. My friend, he said pleasantly in French and tapping Brogard lightly on the shoulder, do you see many of our quality along these parts? Many English travelers, I mean. Brogard looked round at him over his near shoulder, puffed away at his pipe for a moment or two as he was in no hurry, then muttered, Hugh, sometimes. Ah, said Sir Andrew carelessly, English travelers always know where they can get good wine at. My friend? Now tell me, my lady was desiring to know if by any chance you happen to have seen a great friend of hers, an English gentleman, who often comes to Calais on business. He is tall, and recently was on his way to Paris. My lady hoped to have met him in Calais. Marguerite tried not to look at Brogard, lest she should betray before him the burning anxiety with which she waited for his reply. But a freeborn French citizen is never in any hurry to answer questions. Brogard took his time, then he said very slowly, Tall Englishman? Today, yes. You have seen him? Asked Sir Andrew carelessly. Yes, today, muttered Brogard sullenly. Then he quietly took Sir Andrew's hat from a chair close by, put it on his own head, tugged at his dirty blouse, and generally tried to express in pantomime that the individual in question wore very fine clothes. Sacre aristo, he muttered, that tall Englishman? Marguerite could scarce repress a scream. It's Sir Percy right enough, she murmured, and not even in disguise. She smiled in the midst of all her anxiety and through her gathering tears, at thought of the ruling passion strong in death, of Percy running into the wildest, maddest dangers, with the latest cut coat upon his back, and the laces of his jabot unruffled. Oh, the foolhardiness of it, she sighed. Quick, Sir Andrew, asked the man when he went. Ah, yes, my friend, said Sir Andrew, addressing Brogard with the same assumption of carelessness. My lord always wears beautiful clothes. The tall Englishman you saw was certainly my lady's friend. And he has gone, you say? He went, yes, but he's coming back. Here, he ordered supper. Sir Andrew put his hand with a quick gesture of warning upon Marguerite's arm. It came none too soon, for the next moment her wild, mad joy would have betrayed her. He was safe and well, was coming back here presently, she would see him in a few moments perhaps. The wildness of her joy seemed almost more than she could bear. Here, she said to Brogard, who seemed suddenly to have been transformed in her eyes into some heaven-born messenger of bliss. Here, did you say the English gentleman was coming back here? The heaven-born messenger of bliss spat upon the floor, to express his contempt for all and sundry aristos, who chose to haunt the chat gris. Hugh, he muttered, he ordered supper, he will come back. Sacre Anglais, he added by way of protest against all this fuss for a mere Englishman. But where is he now? Do you know? She asked eagerly, placing her dainty white hand upon the dirty sleeve of his blue blouse. He went to get a horse and cart, said Brogard laconically as, with a surly gesture, he shook off from his arm that pretty hand which Princess had been proud to kiss. At what time did he go? But Brogard had evidently had enough of these questionings. He did not think that it was fitting for a citizen, who was the equal of anybody, to be thus catechized by these sacred aristos, even though they were rich English ones. It was distinctly more fitting to his newborn dignity to be as rude as possible. It was a sure sign of servility to meekly reply to civil questions. I don't know, he said surlily. I have said enough voyons les aristos. He came today. He ordered supper. He went out. He'll come back. Voila. And with this parting assertion of his rights as a citizen and a free man, to be as rude as he well pleased, Brogard shuffled out of the room, banging the door after him. Chapter 23. Oh, faith, madam, said Sir Andrew, seeing that Marguerite seemed desirous to call her surly host back again, I think we'd better leave him alone. We shall not get anything more out of him, and we might arouse his suspicions. One never knows what spies may be lurking around these God-forsaken places. What care I, she replied lightly, now I know that my husband is safe, and that I shall see him almost directly. Hush, he said in genuine alarm, for she had talked quite loudly in the fullness of her glee. The very walls have ears in France these days. He rose quickly from the table and walked round the bare, squalid room, listening attentively at the door, through which Brogard had just disappeared, and whence only muttered oaths and shuffling footsteps could be heard. He also ran up the rickety steps that led to the attic, to assure himself that there were no spies of Chauvelin's about the place. Are we alone, monsieur my lackey? Said Marguerite gaily as the young man once more sat down beside her. May we talk? As cautiously as possible, he entreated. Faith, man, but you wear a glum face. As for me, I could dance with joy. Surely there is no longer any cause for fear. Our boat is on the beach, the foam crest not 2 miles out at sea, and my husband will be here, under this very roof, within the next half-hour perhaps. Sure, there is naught to hinder us. Chauvelin and his gang have not yet arrived. Nay, madam, that I fear we do not know. What do you mean? He was at Dover at the same time that we were. Held up by the same storm which kept us from starting. Exactly. But I did not speak of it before, for I feared to alarm you. I saw him on the beach not 5 minutes before we embarked. At least, I swore to myself at the time that it was himself. He was disguised as a cure, so that Satan, his own guardian, would scarce have known him. But I heard him then bargaining for a vessel to take him swiftly to Calais, and he must have set sail less than an hour after we did. Marguerite's face had quickly lost its look of joy. The terrible danger in which Percy stood, now that he was actually on French soil, became suddenly and horribly clear to her. Chauvelin was close upon his heels. Here in Calais the astute diplomatist was all-powerful. A word from him and Percy could be tracked and arrested, and every drop of blood seemed to freeze in her veins. Not even during the moments of her wildest anguish in England had she so completely realized the imminence of the peril in which her husband stood. Chauvelin had sworn to bring the Scarlet Pimpernel to the guillotine, and now the daring plotter, whose anonymity hitherto had been his safeguard, stood revealed through her own hand, to his most bitter, most relentless enemy. Chauvelin, when he waylaid Lord Tony and Sir Andrew Ffoulkes in the coffee-room of the Fisherman's Rest, had obtained possession of all the plans of this latest expedition. Armand St. Just, the Comte de Tournay and other fugitive royalists were to have met the Scarlet Pimpernel, or rather, as it had been originally arranged, 2 of his emissaries, on this day, the 2nd of October, at a place evidently known to the League, and vaguely alluded to as the Père Blanchard's hut. Armand, whose connection with the Scarlet Pimpernel and disavowal of the brutal policy of the Reign of Terror was still unknown to his countrymen, had left England a little more than a week ago, carrying with him the necessary instructions, which would enable him to meet the other fugitives and to convey them to this place of safety. This much Marguerite had fully understood from the first, and Sir Andrew Ffoulkes had confirmed her surmises. She knew, too, that when Sir Percy realized that his own plans and his directions to his lieutenants had been stolen by Chauvelin, it was too late to communicate with Armand, or to send fresh instructions to the fugitives. They would, of necessity, be at the appointed time and place, not knowing how grave was the danger which now awaited their brave rescuer. Blakeney, who as usual had planned and organized the whole expedition, would not allow any of his younger comrades to run the risk of almost certain capture. Hence his hurried note to them at Lord Grenville's ball, "Start myself tomorrow, alone." And now with his identity known to his most bitter enemy, his every step would be dogged, the moment he set foot in France. He would be tracked by Chauvelin's emissaries, followed until he reached that mysterious hut where the fugitives were waiting for him, and there the trap would be closed on him and on them. There was but 1 hour, the hour's start which Marguerite and Sir Andrew had of their enemy, in which to warn Percy of the imminence of his danger, and to persuade him to give up the foolhardy expedition, which could only end in his own death. But there was that 1 hour. "Chauvelin knows of this inn from the papers he stole," said Sir Andrew earnestly, "and on landing will make straight for it." "He has not landed yet," she said. "We have an hour's start on him, and Percy will be here directly. We shall be mid-channel ere Chauvelin has realized that we have slipped through his fingers." She spoke excitedly and eagerly, wishing to infuse into her young friend some of that buoyant hope which still clung to her heart. But he shook his head sadly. "Silent again, Sir Andrew?" she said with some impatience. "Why do you shake your head and look so glum?" "Faith, madam," he replied, "'tis only because in making your rose-colored plans, you are forgetting the most important factor." "What in the world do you mean?" "I am forgetting nothing." "What factor do you mean?" she added with more impatience. "It stands 6 foot odd high," replied Sir Andrew quietly, "and hath name Percy Blakeney." "I don't understand," she murmured. "Do you think that Blakeney would leave Calais without having accomplished what he set out to do?" "You mean?" "There's the old Comte de Tournay." "The Comte?" she murmured. "And Este." "Just. And others." "My brother," she said with a heartbroken sob of anguish. "Heaven help me, but I fear I had forgotten. Fugitives as they are, these men at this moment await with perfect confidence and unshaken faith the arrival of the Scarlet Pimpernel, who has pledged his honor to take them safely across the Channel." Indeed she had forgotten. With the sublime selfishness of a woman who loves with her whole heart, she had in the last 24 hours had no thought save for him. His precious, noble life, his danger, he, the loved one, the brave hero, he alone dwelt in her mind. "My brother," she murmured, as one by one the heavy tears gathered in her eyes, as memory came back to her of Armand, the companion and darling of her childhood, the man for whom she had committed the deadly sin, which had so hopelessly imperiled her brave husband's life. "Sir Percy Blakeney would not be the trusted, honored leader of a score of English gentlemen," said Sir Andrew proudly, "if he abandoned those who placed their trust in him. As for breaking his word, the very thought is preposterous." There was silence for a moment or two. Marguerite had buried her face in her hands, and was letting the tears slowly trickle through her trembling fingers. The young man said nothing. His heart ached for this beautiful woman in her awful grief. All along he had felt the terrible impasse in which her own rash act had plunged them all. He knew his friend and leader so well, with his reckless daring, his mad bravery, his worship of his own word of honor. Sir Andrew knew that Blakeney would brave any danger, run the wildest risks sooner than break it, and with Chauvelin at his very heels, would make a final attempt, however desperate, to rescue those who trusted in him. "Faith, Sir Andrew," said Marguerite at last, making brave efforts to dry her tears, "you are right, and I would not now shame myself by trying to dissuade him from doing his duty. As you say, I should plead in vain. God grant him strength and ability," she added fervently and resolutely, "to outwit his pursuers. He will not refuse to take you with him, perhaps, when he starts on his noble work. Between you, you will have cunning as well as valor. God guard you both. In the meanwhile I think we should lose no time. I still believe that his safety depends upon his knowing that Chauvelin is on his track. Undoubtedly. He has wonderful resources at his command. As soon as he is aware of his danger he will exercise more caution. His ingenuity is a veritable miracle. Then what say you to a voyage of reconnaissance in the village whilst I wait here against his coming? You might come across Percy's track and thus save valuable time. If you find him, tell him to beware. His bitterest enemy is on his heels. But this is such a villainous hole for you to wait in. Nay, that I do not mind. But you might ask our surly host if he could let me wait in another room, where I could be safer from the prying eyes of any chance traveler. Offer him some ready money, so that he should not fail to give me word the moment the tall Englishman returns." She spoke quite calmly, even cheerfully now, thinking out her plans, ready for the worst if need be. She would show no more weakness, she would prove herself worthy of him, who was about to give his life for the sake of his fellow men. Sir Andrew obeyed her without further comment. Instinctively he felt that hers now was the stronger mind. He was willing to give himself over to her guidance to become the hand, whilst she was the directing head. He went to the door of the inner room, through which Brogard and his wife had disappeared before, and knocked. As usual, he was answered by a salvo of muttered oaths. "Friend Brogard," said the young man peremptorily, "my lady would wish to rest here a while. Could you give her the use of another room? She would wish to be alone." He took some money out of his pocket and allowed it to jingle significantly in his hand. Brogard had opened the door and listened with his usual surly apathy to the young man's request. At sight of the gold, however, his lazy attitude relaxed slightly. He took his pipe from his mouth and shuffled into the room. He then pointed over his shoulder at the attic up in the wall. "She can wait up there," he said with a grunt. "It's comfortable and I have no other room." "Nothing could be better," said Marguerite in English. She at once realized the advantages such a position hidden from view would give her. "Give him the money, Sir Andrew. I shall be quite happy up there, and can see everything without being seen." She nodded to Brogard, who condescended to go up to the attic, and to shake up the straw that lay on the floor. "May I entreat you, madam, to do nothing rash," said Sir Andrew, as Marguerite prepared in her turn to ascend the rickety flight of steps. "Remember, this place is infested with spies. Do not, I beg of you, reveal yourself to Sir Percy, unless you are absolutely certain that you are alone with him." Even as he spoke, he felt how unnecessary was this caution. Marguerite was as calm, as clear-headed as any man. There was no fear of her doing anything that was rash. "Nay," she said with a slight attempt at cheerfulness, "that can I faithfully promise you. I would not jeopardize my husband's life, nor yet his plans, by speaking to him before strangers. Have no fear, I will watch my opportunity, and serve him in the manner I think he needs it most." Brogard had come down the steps again, and Marguerite was ready to go up to her safe retreat. "I dare not kiss your hand, madam," said Sir Andrew as she began to mount the steps, "since I am your lackey, but I pray you be of good cheer. If I do not come across Blakeney in half an hour, I shall return, expecting to find him here." "Yes, that will be best. We can afford to wait for half an hour. Chauvelin cannot possibly be here before that. God grant that either you or I may have seen Percy by then. Good luck to you, friend. Have no fear for me." Lightly she mounted the rickety wooden steps that led to the attic. Brogard was taking no further heed of her. She could make herself comfortable there or not as she chose. Sir Andrew watched her until she had reached the loft and sat down upon the straw. She pulled the tattered curtains across, and the young man noted that she was singularly well placed there, for seeing and hearing, whilst remaining unobserved. He had paid Brogard well. The surly old innkeeper would have no object in betraying her. Then Sir Andrew prepared to go. At the door he turned once again and looked up at the loft. Through the ragged curtains Marguerite's sweet face was peeping down at him, and the young man rejoiced to see that it looked serene and even gently smiling. With a final nod of farewell to her, he walked out into the night. Chapter 24. The Death Trap. The next quarter of an hour went by swiftly and noiselessly. In the room downstairs, Brogard had for a while busied himself with clearing the table and rearranging it for another guest. It was because she watched these preparations that Marguerite found the time slipping by more pleasantly. It was for Percy that this semblance of supper was being got ready. Evidently Brogard had a certain amount of respect for the tall Englishman, as he seemed to take some trouble in making the place look a trifle less uninviting than it had done before. He even produced, from some hidden recess in the old dresser, what actually looked like a tablecloth, and when he spread it out and saw it was full of holes, he shook his head dubiously for a while, then was at much pains so to spread it over the table as to hide most of its blemishes. Then he got out a serviette, also old and ragged, but possessing some measure of cleanliness, and with this he carefully wiped the glasses, spoons and plates which he put on the table. Marguerite could not help smiling to herself as she watched all these preparations, which Brogard accomplished to an accompaniment of muttered oaths. Clearly the great height and bulk of the Englishman, or perhaps the weight of his fist, had overawed this freeborn citizen of France, or he would never have been at such trouble for any sacré aristo. When the table was set, such as it was, Brogard surveyed it with evident satisfaction. He then dusted one of the chairs with the corner of his blouse, gave a stir to the stockpot, threw a fresh bundle of faggots onto the fire, and slouched out of the room. Marguerite was left alone with her reflections. She had spread her traveling cloak over the straw, and was sitting fairly comfortably as the straw was fresh, and the evil odors from below came up to her only in a modified form. But momentarily she was almost happy because when she peeped through the tattered curtains she could see a rickety chair, a torn tablecloth, a glass, a plate and a spoon, that was all. But those mute and ugly things seemed to say to her that they were waiting for Percy, that soon, very soon, he would be here, that the squalid room being still empty, they would be alone together. That thought was so heavenly, that Marguerite closed her eyes in order to shut out everything but that. In a few minutes she would be alone with him. She would run down the ladder and let him see her. Then he would take her in his arms and she would let him see that after that she would gladly die for him and with him, for earth could hold no greater happiness than that. And then what would happen? She could not even remotely conjecture. She knew of course that Sir Andrew was right, that Percy would do everything he had set out to accomplish, that she, now she was here, could do nothing beyond warning him to be cautious, since Chauvelin himself was on his track. After having cautioned him, she would perforce have to see him go off upon his terrible and daring mission. She could not even with a word or look, attempt to keep him back. She would have to obey whatever he told her to do, even perhaps have to efface herself and wait, in indescribable agony, whilst he, perhaps, went to his death. But even that seemed less terrible to bear than the thought that he should never know how much she loved him, that at any rate would be spared her. The squalid room itself, which seemed to be waiting for him, told her that he would be here soon. Suddenly her oversensitive ears caught the sound of distant footsteps drawing near. Her heart gave a wild leap of joy. Was it Percy at last? No. The step did not seem quite as long, nor quite as firm as his. She also thought that she could hear two distinct sets of footsteps. Yes, that was it. Two men were coming this way. Two strangers perhaps to get a drink or... But she had not time to conjecture, for presently there was a peremptory call at the door, and the next moment it was violently thrown open from the outside, whilst a rough, commanding voice shouted, "Hey, Citoyen Brogard." Hola. Marguerite could not see the newcomers, but through a hole in one of the curtains she could observe one portion of the room below. She heard Brogard's shuffling footsteps as he came out of the inner room, muttering his usual string of oaths. On seeing the strangers, however, he paused in the middle of the room, well within range of Marguerite's vision, looked at them with even more withering contempt than he had bestowed upon his former guests, and muttered, "Sacré Soutan." Marguerite's heart seemed all at once to stop beating. Her eyes, large and dilated, had fastened on one of the newcomers who at this point had taken a quick step forward towards Brogard. He was dressed in the soutane, broad-brimmed hat and buckled shoes habitual to the French cure, but as he stood opposite the innkeeper, he threw open his soutane for a moment, displaying the tricolour scarf of officialism, which sight immediately had the effect of transforming Brogard's attitude of contempt into one of cringing obsequiousness. It was the sight of this French cure, which seemed to freeze the very blood in Marguerite's veins. She could not see his face, which was shaded by his broad-brimmed hat, but she recognized the thin, bony hands, the slight stoop, the whole gait of the man. It was Chauvelin. The horror of the situation struck her as with a physical blow. The awful disappointment, the dread of what was to come, made her very senses reel, and she needed almost superhuman effort, not to fall senseless beneath it all. "A plate of soup and a bottle of wine," said Chauvelin imperiously to Brogard. "Then clear out of here, understand? I want to be alone." Silently, and without any muttering this time, Brogard obeyed. Chauvelin sat down at the table which had been prepared for the tall Englishman, and the innkeeper busied himself obsequiously round him, dishing up the soup and pouring out the wine. The man who had entered with Chauvelin and whom Marguerite could not see, stood waiting close by the door. At a brusque sign from Chauvelin, Brogard had hurried back to the inner room, and the former now beckoned to the man who had accompanied him. In him Marguerite at once recognized Desgas, Chauvelin's secretary and confidential factotum, whom she had often seen in Paris in the days gone by. He crossed the room and for a moment or two listened attentively at the Brogard's door. "Not listening?" asked Chauvelin curtly. "No, citoyen." For a second Marguerite dreaded lest Chauvelin should order Desgas to search the place. What would happen if she were to be discovered, she hardly dared to imagine. Fortunately, however, Chauvelin seemed more impatient to talk to his secretary than afraid of spies, for he called Desgas quickly back to his side. "The English schooner?" he asked. "She was lost sight of at sundown, citoyen," replied Desgas, but was then making west towards Cap Gris-Nez. "Ah, good," muttered Chauvelin. "And now about Captain Jutley? What did he say?" "He assured me that all the orders you sent him last week have been implicitly obeyed. All the roads which converge to this place have been patrolled night and day ever since, and the beach and cliffs have been most rigorously searched and guarded." "Does he know where this Père Blanchard's hut is?" "No, citoyen, nobody seems to know of it by that name." There are any amount of fishermen's huts all along the coast, of course, but that'll do. Now about tonight? Interrupted Chauvelin impatiently. The roads and the beach are patrolled as usual, citoyen, and Captain Jutley awaits further orders. Go back to him at once, then. Tell him to send reinforcements to the various patrols, and especially to those along the beach. You understand? Chauvelin spoke curtly and to the point, and every word he uttered struck at Marguerite's heart like the death knell of her fondest hopes. The men, he continued, are to keep the sharpest possible lookout for any stranger who may be walking, riding, or driving along the road or the beach, more especially for a tall stranger, whom I need not describe further, as probably he will be disguised, but he cannot very well conceal his height except by stooping. You understand? Perfectly, citoyen, replied Desgas. As soon as any of the men have sighted a stranger, 2 of them are to keep him in view. The man who loses sight of the tall stranger after he is once seen will pay for his negligence with his life, but 1 man is to ride straight back here and report to me. Is that clear? Absolutely clear, citoyen. Very well then. Go and see Jutley at once. See the reinforcements start off for the patrol duty, then ask the captain to let you have half a dozen more men and bring them here with you. You can be back in 10 minutes. Go. Desgas saluted and went to the door. As Marguerite, sick with horror, listened to Chauvelin's directions to his underling, the whole of the plan for the capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel became appallingly clear to her. Chauvelin wished that the fugitives should be left in false security waiting in their hidden retreat until Percy joined them. Then the daring plotter was to be surrounded and caught red-handed, in the very act of aiding and abetting royalists, who were traitors to the Republic. Thus, if his capture were noised abroad, even the British government could not legally protest in his favor. Having plotted with the enemies of the French government, France had the right to put him to death. Escape for him and them would be impossible. All the roads patrolled and watched, the trap well set, the net wide at present, but drawing together tighter and tighter, until it closed upon the daring plotter, whose superhuman cunning even could not rescue him from its meshes now. Desgas was about to go, but Chauvelin once more called him back. Marguerite vaguely wondered what further devilish plans he could have formed, in order to entrap 1 brave man alone, against 20 of others. She looked at him as he turned to speak to Desgas. She could just see his face beneath the broad-brimmed cuirass hat. There was at that moment so much deadly hatred, such fiendish malice in the thin face and pale, small eyes, that Marguerite's last hope died in her heart, for she felt that from this man she could expect no mercy. I had forgotten, repeated Chauvelin, with a weird chuckle as he rubbed his bony talon-like hands one against the other, with a gesture of fiendish satisfaction. The tall stranger may show fight. In any case no shooting, remember, except as a last resort. I want that tall stranger alive, if possible. He laughed, as Dante has told us that the devils laugh at sight of the torture of the damned. Marguerite had thought that by now she had lived through the whole gamut of horror and anguish that human heart could bear. Yet now, when Desgas left the house and she remained alone in this lonely, squalid room, with that fiend for company, she felt as if all that she had suffered was nothing compared with this. He continued to laugh and chuckle to himself for a while, rubbing his hands together in anticipation of his triumph. His plans were well laid and he might well triumph. Not a loophole was left through which the bravest, the most cunning man might escape. Every road guarded, every corner watched, and in that lonely hut somewhere on the coast, a small band of fugitives waiting for their rescuer, and leading him to his death, nay, to worse than death. That fiend there, in a holy man's garb, was too much of a devil to allow a brave man to die the quick, sudden death of a soldier at the post of duty. He, above all, longed to have the cunning enemy who had so long baffled him, helpless in his power. He wished to gloat over him, to enjoy his downfall, to inflict upon him what moral and mental torture a deadly hatred alone can devise. The brave eagle, captured and with noble wings clipped, was doomed to endure the gnawing of the rat. And she, his wife, who loved him and who had brought him to this, could do nothing to help him. Nothing save to hope for death by his side, and for one brief moment in which to tell him that her love, whole, true and passionate, was entirely his. Chauvelin was now sitting close to the table. He had taken off his hat, and Marguerite could just see the outline of his thin profile and pointed chin, as he bent over his meager supper. He was evidently quite contented and awaited events with perfect calm. He even seemed to enjoy Brogard's unsavory fare. Marguerite wondered how so much hatred could lurk in one human being against another. Suddenly, as she watched Chauvelin, a sound caught her ear, which turned her very heart to stone. And yet that sound was not calculated to inspire anyone with horror, for it was merely the cheerful sound of a gay, fresh voice singing lustily, "God save the King." Chapter 25. The Eagle and the Fox. Marguerite's breath stopped short. She seemed to feel her very life standing still momentarily while she listened to that voice and to that song. In the singer she had recognized her husband. Chauvelin too had heard it, for he darted a quick glance towards the door, then hurriedly took up his broad-brimmed hat and clapped it over his head. The voice drew nearer. For one brief second the wild desire seized Marguerite to rush down the steps and fly across the room, to stop that song at any cost, to beg the cheerful singer to fly for his life before it be too late. She checked the impulse just in time. Chauvelin would stop her before she reached the door, and moreover she had no idea if he had any soldiers posted within his call. Her impetuous act might prove the death signal of the man she would have died to save. "Long to reign over us. God save the King," sang the voice more lustily than ever. The next moment the door was thrown open and there was dead silence for a second or so. Marguerite could not see the door. She held her breath, trying to imagine what was happening. Percy Blakeney on entering had of course at once caught sight of the cure at the table. His hesitation lasted less than 5 seconds. The next moment Marguerite saw his tall figure crossing the room, whilst he called in a loud, cheerful voice. "Hello there. No one about? Where's that fool Brogard?" He wore the magnificent coat and riding suit which he had on when Marguerite last saw him at Richmond so many hours ago. As usual, his get-up was absolutely irreproachable. The fine Mechlin lace at his neck and wrists was immaculate in its gossamer daintiness, his hands looked slender and white, his fair hair was carefully brushed, and he carried his eyeglass with his usual affected gesture. In fact, at this moment Sir Percy Blakeney Bart might have been on his way to a garden party at the Prince of Wales, instead of deliberately, cold-bloodedly running his head in a trap, set for him by his deadliest enemy. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room, whilst Marguerite, absolutely paralyzed with horror, seemed unable even to breathe. Every moment she expected that Chauvelin would give a signal, that the place would fill with soldiers, that she would rush down and help Percy to sell his life dearly. As he stood there, suavely unconscious, she very nearly screamed out to him, "Fly, Percy, 'tis your deadly enemy, fly before it be too late." But she had not time even to do that, for the next moment Blakeney quietly walked to the table, and jovially clapping the cure on the back, said in his own drawly, affected way, "Ods fish, Chauvelin. I vow I never thought of meeting you here." Chauvelin, who had been in the very act of conveying soup to his mouth, fairly choked. His thin face became absolutely purple, and a violent fit of coughing saved this cunning representative of France from betraying the most boundless surprise he had ever experienced. There was no doubt that this bold move on the part of the enemy had been wholly unexpected as far as he was concerned, and the daring impudence of it completely nonplussed him for the moment. Obviously he had not taken the precaution of having the inn surrounded with soldiers. Blakeney had evidently guessed that much, and no doubt his resourceful brain had already formed some plan by which he could turn this unexpected interview to account. Marguerite up in the loft had not moved. She had made a solemn promise to Sir Andrew not to speak to her husband before strangers, and she had sufficient self-control not to throw herself unreasoningly and impulsively across his plans. To sit still and watch these two men together was a terrible trial of fortitude. Marguerite had heard Chauvelin give the orders for the patrolling of all the roads. She knew that if Percy now left the Chat Gris, in whichever direction he happened to go, he could not go far without being sighted by some of Captain Jutley's men on patrol. On the other hand, if he stayed, then Desgas would have time to come back with the half-dozen men Chauvelin had specially ordered. The trap was closing in and Marguerite could do nothing but watch and wonder. The two men looked such a strange contrast, and of the two it was Chauvelin who exhibited a slight touch of fear. Marguerite knew him well enough to guess what was passing in his mind. He had no fear for his own person, although he certainly was alone in a lonely inn with a man who was powerfully built, and who was daring and reckless beyond the bounds of probability. She knew that Chauvelin would willingly have braved perilous encounters for the sake of the cause he had at heart, but what he did fear was that this impudent Englishman would, by knocking him down, double his own chances of escape. His underlings might not succeed so well in capturing the Scarlet Pimpernel, when not directed by the cunning hand and the shrewd brain, which had deadly hate for an incentive. Evidently, however, the representative of the French government had nothing to fear for the moment, at the hands of his powerful adversary. Blakeney, with his most inane laugh and pleasant good nature, was solemnly patting him on the back. "I am so demmed sorry," he was saying cheerfully, "So very sorry. I seem to have upset you. Eating soup too. Nasty, awkward thing, soup. Begad, a friend of mine died once. Choked, just like you, with a spoonful of soup." And he smiled shyly, good-humoredly, down at Chauvelin. "Odd's life," he continued as soon as the latter had somewhat recovered himself. "Beastly hole this, ain't it now? What? You don't mind?" he added, apologetically, as he sat down on a chair close to the table and drew the soup tureen towards him. "That fool Brogard seems to be asleep or something." There was a second plate on the table, and he calmly helped himself to soup, then poured himself out a glass of wine. For a moment Marguerite wondered what Chauvelin would do. His disguise was so good that perhaps he meant, on recovering himself, to deny his identity. But Chauvelin was too astute to make such an obviously false and childish move, and already he too had stretched out his hand and said pleasantly, "I am indeed charmed to see you, Sir Percy. You must excuse me, I thought you the other side of the channel." Sudden surprise almost took my breath away. "La," said Sir Percy with a good-humored grin, "it did that quite, didn't it? Chaubertin? Pardon me, Chauvelin. I beg pardon, 1,000 times. Yes, Chauvelin, of course. I never could cotton to foreign names." He was calmly eating his soup, laughing with pleasant good humor, as if he had come all the way to Calais for the express purpose of enjoying supper at this filthy inn, in the company of his arch-enemy. For the moment Marguerite wondered why Percy did not knock the little Frenchman down then and there, and no doubt something of the sort must have darted through his mind, for every now and then his lazy eyes seemed to flash ominously, as they rested on the slight figure of Chauvelin, who had now quite recovered himself and was also calmly eating his soup. But the keen brain, which had planned and carried through so many daring plots, was too far-seeing to take unnecessary risks. This place, after all, might be infested with spies. The innkeeper might be in Chauvelin's pay. One call on Chauvelin's part might bring 20 men about Blakeney's ears for aught he knew, and he might be caught and trapped before he could help or at least warn the fugitives. This he would not risk. He meant to help the others to get them safely away, for he had pledged his word to them and his word he would keep. And whilst he ate and chatted, he thought and planned, whilst up in the loft the poor anxious woman racked her brain as to what she should do, and endured agonies of longing to rush down to him, yet not daring to move for fear of upsetting his plans. "I didn't know," Blakeney was saying jovially, "that you, were in holy orders." Stammered Chauvelin. The calm impudence of his antagonist had evidently thrown him off his usual balance. "But I should have known you anywhere," continued Sir Percy placidly as he poured himself out another glass of wine, "although the wig and hat have changed you a bit." "Do you think so?" "They alter a man so. But, begad, I hope you don't mind my having made the remark?" "Demmed bad form making remarks." "I hope you don't mind." "No, not at all, "I hope Lady Blakeney is well," said Chauvelin, hurriedly changing the topic of conversation. Blakeney, with much deliberation, finished his plate of soup, drank his glass of wine, and momentarily, it seemed to Marguerite as if he glanced quickly all round the room. "Quite well, thank you," he said at last drily. There was a pause, during which Marguerite could watch these two antagonists who, evidently in their minds, were measuring themselves against one another. She could see Percy almost full face where he sat at the table not 10 yards from where she herself was crouching, puzzled, not knowing what to do or what she should think. She had quite controlled her impulse by now of rushing down and disclosing herself to her husband. A man capable of acting a part, in the way he was doing at the present moment, did not need a woman's word to warn him to be cautious. Marguerite indulged in the luxury, dear to every tender woman's heart, of looking at the man she loved. She looked through the tattered curtain, across at the handsome face of her husband, in whose lazy blue eyes, and behind whose inane smile, she could now so plainly see the strength, energy, and resourcefulness which had caused the Scarlet Pimpernel to be reverenced and trusted by his followers. "There are 19 of us ready to lay down our lives for your husband, Lady Blakeney," Sir Andrew had said to her, and as she looked at the forehead, low but square and broad, the eyes, blue yet deep-set and intense, the whole aspect of the man, of indomitable energy hiding, behind a perfectly acted comedy, his almost superhuman strength of will and marvelous ingenuity, she understood the fascination which he exercised over his followers, for had he not also cast his spells over her heart and her imagination? Chauvelin, who was trying to conceal his impatience beneath his usual urbane manner, took a quick look at his watch. Desgas should not be long, another 2 or 3 minutes, and this impudent Englishman would be secure in the keeping of half a dozen of Captain Jutley's most trusted men. "You are on your way to Paris, Sir Percy?" he asked carelessly. "Odd's life, no," replied Blakeney with a laugh. "Only as far as Lille, not Paris for me. Beastly uncomfortable place Paris just now. Monsieur Chaubertin. Beg pardon. Chauvelin." "Not for an English gentleman like yourself, Sir Percy," rejoined Chauvelin sarcastically, "who takes no interest in the conflict that is raging there. Law. You see it's no business of mine, and our demmed government is all on your side of the business. Old Pitt daren't say, bo, to a goose. You are in a hurry, sir," he added as Chauvelin once again took out his watch. "An appointment, perhaps. I pray you take no heed of me. My time's my own." He rose from the table and dragged a chair to the hearth. Once more Marguerite was terribly tempted to go to him, for time was getting on. Desgas might be back at any moment with his men. Percy did not know that, and, oh, how horrible it all was, and how helpless she felt. "I am in no hurry," continued Percy pleasantly, "but, I don't want to spend any more time than I can help in this godforsaken hole. But begad, sir," he added, as Chauvelin had surreptitiously looked at his watch for the third time, "that watch of yours won't go any faster for all the looking you give it. You are expecting a friend, maybe?" "I, a friend. Not a lady, I trust, Monsieur l'Abbé," laughed Blakeney. "Surely the Holy Church does not allow—" What? But I say, come by the fire, it's getting demmed cold." He kicked the fire with the heel of his boot, making the logs blaze in the old hearth. He seemed in no hurry to go, and apparently was quite unconscious of his immediate danger. He dragged another chair to the fire, and Chauvelin, whose impatience was by now quite beyond control, sat down beside the hearth, in such a way as to command a view of the door. Desgas had been gone nearly a quarter of an hour. It was quite plain to Marguerite's aching senses that as soon as he arrived, Chauvelin would abandon all his other plans with regard to the fugitives, and capture this impudent Scarlet Pimpernel at once. "Hey, Chauvelin," the latter was saying airily, "tell me, I pray you, is your friend pretty? Demmed smart these little French women sometimes. What? But I protest I need not ask," he added as he carelessly strode back towards the supper table. "In matters of taste the Church has never been backward." But Chauvelin was not listening. His every faculty was now concentrated on that door through which presently Desgas would enter. Marguerite's thoughts too were centered there, for her ears had suddenly caught, through the stillness of the night, the sound of numerous and measured treads some distance away. It was Desgas and his men. Another 3 minutes and they would be here. Another 3 minutes and the awful thing would have occurred. The brave eagle would have fallen in the ferret's trap. She would have moved now and screamed, but she dared not, for whilst she heard the soldiers approaching, she was looking at Percy and watching his every movement. He was standing by the table whereon the remnants of the supper, plates, glasses, spoons, salt and pepper pots were scattered pell-mell. His back was turned to Chauvelin and he was still prattling along in his own affected and inane way, but from his pocket he had taken his snuff-box, and quickly and suddenly he emptied the contents of the pepper-pot into it. Then he again turned with an inane laugh to Chauvelin. Did you speak, sir?" Chauvelin had been too intent on listening to the sound of those approaching footsteps, to notice what his cunning adversary had been doing. He now pulled himself together, trying to look unconcerned in the very midst of his anticipated triumph. "No," he said presently, "that is, as you were saying, Sir Percy?" "I was saying," said Blakeney, going up to Chauvelin by the fire, "that the Jew in Piccadilly has sold me better snuff this time than I have ever tasted. Will you honor me, Monsieur l'Abbé?" He stood close to Chauvelin in his own careless, debonair way, holding out his snuff-box to his arch-enemy. Chauvelin, who, as he told Marguerite once, had seen a trick or two in his day, had never dreamed of this one. With one ear fixed on those fast-approaching footsteps, one eye turned to that door where Desgas and his men would presently appear, lulled into false security by the impudent Englishman's airy manner, he never even remotely guessed the trick which was being played upon him. He took a pinch of snuff. Only he, who has ever by accident sniffed vigorously a dose of pepper, can have the faintest conception of the hopeless condition in which such a sniff would reduce any human being. Chauvelin felt as if his head would burst. Sneeze after sneeze seemed nearly to choke him. He was blind, deaf, and dumb for the moment, and during that moment Blakeney quietly, without the slightest haste, took up his hat, took some money out of his pocket, which he left on the table, then calmly stalked out of the room. Chapter 26. The Jew. It took Marguerite some time to collect her scattered senses. The whole of this last short episode had taken place in less than a minute, and Desgas and the soldiers were still about 200 yards away from the chat grille. When she realized what had happened, a curious mixture of joy and wonder filled her heart. It all was so neat, so ingenious. Chauvelin was still absolutely helpless, far more so than he could even have been under a blow from the fist, for now he could neither see, nor hear, nor speak, whilst his cunning adversary had quietly slipped through his fingers. Blakeney was gone, obviously to try and join the fugitives at the Père Blanchard's hut. For the moment, true, Chauvelin was helpless. For the moment the daring Scarlet Pimpernel had not been caught by Desgas and his men. But all the roads and the beach were patrolled. Every place was watched and every stranger kept in sight. How far could Percy go, thus arrayed in his gorgeous clothes, without being sighted and followed? Now she blamed herself terribly for not having gone down to him sooner, and given him that word of warning and of love which, perhaps, after all, he needed. He could not know of the orders which Chauvelin had given for his capture, and even now, perhaps. But before all these horrible thoughts had taken concrete form in her brain, she heard the grounding of arms outside, close to the door, and Desgas' voice shouting, "Halt!" to his men. Chauvelin had partially recovered. His sneezing had become less violent, and he had struggled to his feet. He managed to reach the door just as Desgas' knock was heard on the outside. Chauvelin threw open the door, and before his secretary could say a word, he had managed to stammer between two sneezes. "The tall stranger, quick, did any of you see him?" "Where, citoyen?" asked Desgas in surprise. "Here, man. Through that door. Not 5 minutes ago." "We saw nothing, citoyen. The moon is not yet up and—" "And you are just 5 minutes too late, my friend," said Chauvelin with concentrated fury. "Citoyen. You did what I ordered you to do," said Chauvelin with impatience. "I know that, but you were a precious long time about it. Fortunately, there's not much harm done, or it had fared ill with you, citoyen Desgas." Desgas turned a little pale. There was so much rage and hatred in his superior's whole attitude. "The tall stranger, citoyen," he stammered, "was here in this room 5 minutes ago having supper at that table. Damn his impudence. For obvious reasons I dared not tackle him alone. Brogard is too big a fool, and that cursed Englishman appears to have the strength of a bullock, and so he slipped away under your very nose. He cannot go far without being sighted, citoyen. Captain Jutley sent 40 men as reinforcements for the patrol duty. 20 went down to the beach. He again assured me that the watch has been constant all day, and that no stranger could possibly get to the beach or reach a boat without being sighted. That's good. Do the men know their work? They have had very clear orders, citoyen, and I myself spoke to those who were about to start. They are to shadow, as secretly as possible, any stranger they may see, especially if he be tall, or stoop as if he would disguise his height. In no case to detain such a person, of course, said Chauvelin eagerly. That impudent Scarlet Pimpernel would slip through clumsy fingers. We must let him get to the Père Blanchard's hut now, there surround and capture him. The men understand that, citoyen, and also that, as soon as a tall stranger has been sighted, he must be shadowed, whilst one man is to turn straight back and report to you." "That is right," said Chauvelin, rubbing his hands, well pleased. "I have further news for you, citoyen." "What is it?" "A tall Englishman had a long conversation about 3/4 of an hour ago with a Jew, Reuben by name, who lives not 10 paces from here." "Yes, and?" queried Chauvelin impatiently. "The conversation was all about a horse and cart, which the tall Englishman wished to hire, and which was to have been ready for him by 11 o'clock. It is past that now. Where does that Reuben live?" "A few minutes' walk from this door." "Send one of the men to find out if the stranger has driven off in Reuben's cart." "Yes, citoyen." Desgas went to give the necessary orders to one of the men. Not a word of this conversation between him and Chauvelin had escaped Marguerite, and every word they had spoken seemed to strike at her heart, with terrible hopelessness and dark foreboding. She had come all this way, and with such high hopes and firm determination to help her husband, and so far she had been able to do nothing, but to watch, with a heart breaking with anguish, the meshes of the deadly net closing round the daring Scarlet Pimpernel. He could not now advance many steps without spying eyes to track and denounce him. Her own helplessness struck her with the terrible sense of utter disappointment. The possibility of being of the slightest use to her husband had become almost nil, and her only hope rested in being allowed to share his fate, whatever it might ultimately be. For the moment, even her chance of ever seeing the man she loved again had become a remote one. Still, she was determined to keep a close watch over his enemy, and a vague hope filled her heart, that whilst she kept Chauvelin in sight, Percy's fate might still be hanging in the balance. Desgas had left Chauvelin moodily pacing up and down the room, whilst he himself waited outside for the return of the man whom he had sent in search of Reuben. Thus several minutes went by. Chauvelin was evidently devoured with impatience. Apparently he trusted no one. This last trick played upon him by the daring Scarlet Pimpernel had made him suddenly doubtful of success, unless he himself was there to watch, direct and superintend the capture of this impudent Englishman. About 5 minutes later, Desgas returned, followed by an elderly Jew in a dirty, threadbare gabardine, worn greasy across the shoulders. His red hair, which he wore after the fashion of the Polish Jews, with the corkscrew curls each side of his face, was plentifully sprinkled with gray. A general coating of grime about his cheeks and his chin gave him a peculiarly dirty and loathsome appearance. He had the habitual stoop, those of his race affected in mock humility in past centuries, before the dawn of equality and freedom in matters of faith, and he walked behind Desgas with the peculiar shuffling gait which has remained the characteristic of the Jew trader in continental Europe to this day. Chauvelin, who had all the Frenchman's prejudice against the despised race, motioned to the fellow to keep at a respectful distance. The group of the three men were standing just underneath the hanging oil lamp, and Marguerite had a clear view of them all. "Is this the man?" asked Chauvelin. "No, citoyen," replied Desgas. "Reuben could not be found, so presumably his cart has gone with the stranger. But this man here seems to know something, which he is willing to sell for a consideration." "Ah," said Chauvelin, turning away with disgust from the loathsome specimen of humanity before him. The Jew, with characteristic patience, stood humbly on one side, leaning on a thick knotted staff, his greasy broad-brimmed hat casting a deep shadow over his grimy face, waiting for the noble excellency to deign to put some questions to him. "The citoyen tells me," said Chauvelin peremptorily to him, "that you know something of my friend, the tall Englishman whom I desire to meet. Morbleu! Keep your distance, man," he added hurriedly as the Jew took a quick and eager step forward. "Yes, your excellency," replied the Jew, who spoke the language with that peculiar lisp which denotes Eastern origin. "I and Reuben Goldstein met a tall Englishman on the road close by here this evening." "Did you speak to him?" "He spoke to us, your excellency. He wanted to know if he could hire a horse and cart to go down along the St. Martin road, to a place he wanted to reach tonight." "What did you say?" "I did not say anything," said the Jew in an injured tone. "Reuben Goldstein, that accursed traitor, that son of Belial—" "Cut that short, man," interrupted Chauvelin roughly, "and go on with your story." "He took the words out of my mouth, your excellency, when I was about to offer the wealthy Englishman my horse and cart, to take him wheresoever he chose. Reuben had already spoken, and offered his half-starved nag and his broken-down cart." "And what did the Englishman do?" "He listened to Reuben Goldstein, your excellency, and put his hand in his pocket then and there, and took out a handful of gold, which he showed to that descendant of Beelzebub, telling him that all that would be his, if the horse and cart were ready for him by 11 o'clock. And of course the horse and cart were ready? Well, they were ready in a manner, so to speak, your excellency. Reuben's nag was lame as usual. She refused to budge at first. It was only after a time and with plenty of kicks, that she at last could be made to move," said the Jew with a malicious chuckle. "Then they started?" "Yes, they started about 5 minutes ago. I was disgusted with that stranger's folly. An Englishman too. He ought to have known Reuben's nag was not fit to drive. But if he had no choice?" "No choice, your excellency?" protested the Jew in a rasping voice. "Did I not repeat to him a dozen times that my horse and cart would take him quicker and more comfortably than Reuben's bag of bones? You would not listen. Reuben is such a liar and has such insinuating ways." The stranger was deceived. "If he was in a hurry, he would have had better value for his money by taking my cart." "You have a horse and cart too, then?" asked Chauvelin peremptorily. "Why, that I have, your excellency, and if your excellency wants to drive." "Do you happen to know which way my friend went in Reuben Goldstein's cart?" Thoughtfully the Jew rubbed his dirty chin. Marguerite's heart was beating well nigh to bursting. She had heard the peremptory question. She looked anxiously at the Jew, but could not read his face beneath the shadow of his broad-brimmed hat. Vaguely she felt somehow as if he held Percy's fate in his long dirty hands. There was a long pause, whilst Chauvelin frowned impatiently at the stooping figure before him. At last the Jew slowly put his hand in his breast pocket, and drew out from its capacious depths a number of silver coins. He gazed at them thoughtfully, then remarked in a quiet tone of voice, "This is what the tall stranger gave me when he drove away with Reuben, for holding my tongue about him and his doings. Chauvelin shrugged his shoulders impatiently. How much is there? He asked. 20 francs, your excellency, replied the Jew, and I have been an honest man all my life. Chauvelin without further comment took a few pieces of gold out of his own pocket, and leaving them in the palm of his hand, he allowed them to jingle as he held them out towards the Jew. How many gold pieces are there in the palm of my hand? He asked quietly. Evidently he had no desire to terrorize the man, but to conciliate him for his own purposes, for his manner was pleasant and suave. No doubt he feared that threats of the guillotine and various other persuasive methods of that type might addle the old man's brains, and that he would be more likely to be useful through greed of gain than through terror of death. The eyes of the Jew shot a quick, keen glance at the gold in his interlocutor's hand. At least 5, I should say, your excellency, he replied obsequiously. Enough, do you think, to loosen that honest tongue of yours? What does your excellency wish to know? Whether your horse and cart can take me to where I can find my friend the tall stranger, who has driven off in Reuben Goldstein's cart? My horse and cart can take your honor there where you please. To a place called the Père Blanchard's hut? Your honor has guessed, said the Jew in astonishment. You know the place? I know it, your honor. Which road leads to it? The St. Martin Road, your honor, then a footpath from there to the cliffs. You know the road? Repeated Chauvelin roughly. Every stone, every blade of grass, your honor, replied the Jew quietly. Chauvelin without another word threw the 5 pieces of gold one by one before the Jew, who knelt down, and on his hands and knees struggled to collect them. One rolled away and he had some trouble to get it, for it had lodged underneath the dresser. Chauvelin quietly waited while the old man scrambled on the floor to find the piece of gold. When the Jew was again on his feet, Chauvelin said, How soon can your horse and cart be ready? They are ready now, your honor. Where? Not 10 meters from this door. Will your excellency deign to look? I don't want to see it. How far can you drive me in it? As far as the Père Blanchard's hut, your honor, and further than Reuben's nag took your friend. I am sure that, not 2 leagues from here, we shall come across that wily Reuben, his nag, his cart and the tall stranger all in a heap in the middle of the road. How far is the nearest village from here? On the road which the Englishman took, Miquelon is the nearest village, not 2 leagues from here. There he could get fresh conveyance if he wanted to go further? He could, if he ever got so far. Can you? Will your excellency try? Said the Jew simply. That is my intention, said Chauvelin very quietly, but remember, if you have deceived me, I shall tell off 2 of my most stalwart soldiers to give you such a beating, that your breath will perhaps leave your ugly body forever. But if we find my friend the tall Englishman, either on the road or at the Père Blanchard's hut, there will be 10 more gold pieces for you. Do you accept the bargain? The Jew again thoughtfully rubbed his chin. He looked at the money in his hand, then at his stern interlocutor, and at Desgas, who had stood silently behind him all this while. After a moment's pause, he said deliberately, I accept. Go and wait outside then, said Chauvelin, and remember to stick to your bargain, or by heaven, I will keep to mine. With a final, most abject and cringing bow, the old Jew shuffled out of the room. Chauvelin seemed pleased with his interview, for he rubbed his hands together, with that usual gesture of his, of malignant satisfaction. My coat and boots, he said to Desgas at last. Desgas went to the door and apparently gave the necessary orders, for presently a soldier entered, carrying Chauvelin's coat, boots, and hat. He took off his soutane, beneath which he was wearing close-fitting breeches and a cloth waistcoat, and began changing his attire. You, citoyen, in the meanwhile, he said to Desgas, go back to Captain Jutley as fast as you can, and tell him to let you have another 12 men, and bring them with you along the St. Martin Road, where I dare say you will soon overtake the Jew's cart with myself in it. There will be hot work presently, if I mistake not, in the Père Blanchard's hut. We shall corner our game there, I'll warrant, for this impudent Scarlet Pimpernel has had the audacity, or the stupidity, I hardly know which, to adhere to his original plans. He has gone to meet de Tournay, Saint Just and the other traitors, which for the moment I thought perhaps he did not intend to do. When we find them, there will be a band of desperate men at bay. Some of our men will, I presume, be put hors de combat. These royalists are good swordsmen, and the Englishman is devilish cunning and looks very powerful. Still, we shall be 5 against 1 at least. You can follow the cart closely with your men, all along the St. Martin Road, through Miquelon. The Englishman is ahead of us and not likely to look behind him. Whilst he gave these curt and concise orders, he had completed his change of attire. The priest's costume had been laid aside, and he was once more dressed in his usual dark, tight-fitting clothes. At last he took up his hat. "I shall have an interesting prisoner to deliver into your hands," he said with a chuckle, as with unwanted familiarity he took Desca's arm and led him towards the door. "We won't kill him outright, friend Descas? The Père Blanchard's hut is, and I mistake not, a lonely spot upon the beach, and our men will enjoy a bit of rough sport there with the wounded fox. Choose your men well, friend Descas, of the sort who would enjoy that type of sport, eh? We must see that Scarlet Pimpernel wither a bit, what? Shrink and tremble, eh? Before we finally—" He made an expressive gesture whilst he laughed a low, evil laugh, which filled Marguerite's soul with sickening horror. "Choose your men well, Citoyen Desgas," he said once more as he led his secretary finally out of the room. Chapter 27. On the track. Never for a moment did Marguerite Blakeney hesitate. The last sounds outside the Chat Gris had died away in the night. She had heard Desgas giving orders to his men, and then starting off towards the fort, to get a reinforcement of a dozen more men. 6 were not thought sufficient to capture the cunning Englishman, whose resourceful brain was even more dangerous than his valor and his strength. Then a few minutes later she heard the Jew's husky voice again, evidently shouting to his nag, then the rumble of wheels and noise of a rickety cart bumping over the rough road. Inside the inn everything was still. Brogard and his wife, terrified of Chauvelin, had given no sign of life. They hoped to be forgotten, and at any rate to remain unperceived. Marguerite could not even hear their usual volleys of muttered oaths. She waited a moment or two longer, then she quietly slipped down the broken stairs, wrapped her dark cloak closely round her and slipped out of the inn. The night was fairly dark, sufficiently so at any rate to hide her dark figure from view, whilst her keen ears kept count of the sound of the cart going on ahead. She hoped by keeping well within the shadow of the ditches which lined the road, that she would not be seen by Desca's men, when they approached, or by the patrols, which she concluded were still on duty. Thus she started to do this, the last stage of her weary journey, alone, at night, and on foot. Nearly 3 leagues to Miquelon, and then on to the Père Blanchard's hut, wherever that fatal spot might be, probably over rough roads, she cared not. The Jew's nag could not get on very fast, and though she was weary with mental fatigue and nerve strain, she knew that she could easily keep up with it on a hilly road, where the poor beast, who was sure to be half-starved, would have to be allowed long and frequent rests. The road lay some distance from the sea, bordered on either side by shrubs and stunted trees, sparsely covered with meager foliage, all turning away from the north, with their branches looking in the semi-darkness, like stiff, ghostly hair, blown by a perpetual wind. Fortunately, the moon showed no desire to peep between the clouds, and Marguerite, hugging the edge of the road, and keeping close to the low line of shrubs, was fairly safe from view. Everything around her was so still, only from far, very far away, there came like a long, soft moan, the sound of the distant sea. The air was keen and full of brine. After that enforced period of inactivity, inside the evil-smelling, squalid inn, Marguerite would have enjoyed the sweet scent of this autumnal night, and the distant melancholy rumble of the waves. She would have revelled in the calm and stillness of this lonely spot, a calm broken only at intervals by the strident and mournful cry of some distant gull, and by the creaking of the wheels, some way down the road. She would have loved the cool atmosphere, the peaceful immensity of nature in this lonely part of the coast, but her heart was too full of cruel foreboding, of a great ache and longing for a being who had become infinitely dear to her. Her feet slipped on the grassy bank, for she thought it safest not to walk near the center of the road, and she found it difficult to keep up a sharp pace along the muddy incline. She even thought it best not to keep too near to the cart. Everything was so still that the rumble of the wheels could not fail to be a safe guide. The loneliness was absolute. Already the few dim lights of Calais lay far behind, and on this road there was not a sign of human habitation, not even the hut of a fisherman or of a woodcutter anywhere near. Far away on her right was the edge of the cliff, below it the rough beach, against which the incoming tide was dashing itself with its constant, distant murmur. And ahead the rumble of the wheels, bearing an implacable enemy to his triumph. Marguerite wondered at what particular spot on this lonely coast Percy could be at this moment. Not very far surely, for he had had less than a quarter of an hour's start of Chauvelin. She wondered if he knew that in this cool, ocean-scented bit of France, there lurked many spies, all eager to sight his tall figure, to track him to where his unsuspecting friends waited for him, and then to close the net over him and them. Chauvelin, on ahead, jolted and jostled in the Jew's vehicle, was nursing comfortable thoughts. He rubbed his hands together with content as he thought of the web which he had woven, and through which that ubiquitous and daring Englishman could not hope to escape. As the time went on, and the old Jew drove him leisurely but surely along the dark road, he felt more and more eager for the grand finale of this exciting chase after the mysterious Scarlet Pimpernel. The capture of the audacious plotter would be the finest leaf in Citoyen Chauvelin's wreath of glory. Caught, red-handed, on the spot, in the very act of aiding and abetting the traitors against the Republic of France, the Englishman could claim no protection from his own country. Chauvelin had, in any case, fully made up his mind that all intervention should come too late. Never for a moment did the slightest remorse enter his heart, as to the terrible position in which he had placed the unfortunate wife, who had unconsciously betrayed her husband. As a matter of fact, Chauvelin had ceased even to think of her. She had been a useful tool, that was all. The Jew's lean nag did little more than walk. She was going along at a slow jog-trot, and her driver had to give her long and frequent halts. "Are we a long way yet from Miquelon?" asked Chauvelin from time to time. "Not very far, your honor," was the uniform placid reply. "We have not yet come across your friend and mine, lying in a heap in the roadway," was Chauvelin's sarcastic comment. "Patience, noble excellency," rejoined the son of Moses, "they are ahead of us. I can see the imprint of the cart wheels, driven by that traitor, that son of the Amalekite." "You are sure of the road?" "As sure as I am of the presence of those 10 gold pieces in the noble excellency's pockets, which I trust will presently be mine. As soon as I have shaken hands with my friend the tall stranger, they will certainly be yours." "Hark, what was that?" said the Jew suddenly. Through the stillness, which had been absolute, there could now be heard distinctly the sound of horses' hoofs on the muddy road. "They are soldiers," he added in an awed whisper. "Stop a moment, I want to hear," said Chauvelin. Marguerite had also heard the sound of galloping hoofs, coming towards the cart and towards herself. For some time she had been on the alert, thinking that Desgas and his squad would soon overtake them, but these came from the opposite direction, presumably from Miquelon. The darkness lent her sufficient cover. She had perceived that the cart had stopped, and with utmost caution, treading noiselessly on the soft road, she crept a little nearer. Her heart was beating fast, she was trembling in every limb. Already she had guessed what news these mounted men would bring. Every stranger on these roads or on the beach must be shadowed, especially if he be tall or stoops as if he would disguise his height. When sighted, a mounted messenger must at once ride back and report. Those had been Chauvelin's orders. Had then the tall stranger been sighted, and was this the mounted messenger, come to bring the great news, that the hunted hare had run its head into the noose at last? Marguerite, realizing that the cart had come to a standstill, managed to slip nearer to it in the darkness. She crept close up, hoping to get within earshot, to hear what the messenger had to say. She heard the quick words of challenge. "Liberté, fraternité, égalité." Then Chauvelin's quick query. "What news?" 2 men on horseback had halted beside the vehicle. Marguerite could see them silhouetted against the midnight sky. She could hear their voices and the snorting of their horses, and now behind her, some little distance off, the regular and measured tread of a body of advancing men, Desgas and his soldiers. There had been a long pause, during which, no doubt, Chauvelin satisfied the men as to his identity, for presently, questions and answers followed each other in quick succession. "You have seen the stranger?" asked Chauvelin eagerly. "No, citoyen, we have seen no tall stranger. We came by the edge of the cliff." "Then?" "Less than a quarter of a league beyond Miquelon, we came across a rough construction of wood, which looked like the hut of a fisherman, where he might keep his tools and nets. When we first sighted it, it seemed to be empty, and at first we thought that there was nothing suspicious about it, until we saw some smoke issuing through an aperture at the side. I dismounted and crept close to it. It was then empty, but in one corner of the hut, there was a charcoal fire, and a couple of stools were also in the hut. I consulted with my comrades, and we decided that they should take cover with the horses, well out of sight, and that I should remain on the watch, which I did." "Well, and did you see anything?" "About half an hour later, I heard voices, citoyen, and presently 2 men came along towards the edge of the cliff. They seemed to me to have come from the Lille road. One was young, the other quite old. They were talking in a whisper to one another, and I could not hear what they said. One was young, the other quite old." Marguerite's aching heart almost stopped beating as she listened. Was the young one Armand, her brother? And the old one de Tournay? Were they the 2 fugitives who, unconsciously, were used as a decoy to entrap their fearless and noble rescuer? "The 2 men presently went into the hut," continued the soldier, whilst Marguerite's aching nerves seemed to catch the sound of Chauvelin's triumphant chuckle, "and I crept nearer to it then. The hut is very roughly built, and I caught snatches of their conversation. Yes. Quick, what did you hear? The old man asked the young one if he were sure that was the right place. Oh yes, he replied, 'tis the place sure enough, and by the light of the charcoal fire he showed to his companion a paper which he carried. Here is the plan, he said, which he gave me before I left London. We were to adhere strictly to that plan, unless I had contrary orders, and I have had none. Here is the road we followed, see, here the fork, here we cut across the St. Martin Road, and here is the footpath which brought us to the edge of the cliff. I must have made a slight noise then, for the young man came to the door of the hut, and peered anxiously all round him. When he again joined his companion, they whispered so low, that I could no longer hear them. Well, and? Asked Chauvelin impatiently. There were 6 of us altogether, patrolling that part of the beach, so we consulted together, and thought it best that 4 should remain behind and keep the hut in sight, and I and my comrade rode back at once to make report of what we had seen. You saw nothing of the tall stranger? Nothing, citoyen. If your comrades see him, what would they do? Not lose sight of him for a moment, and if he showed signs of escape or any boat came in sight, they would close in on him, and if necessary they would shoot. The firing would bring the rest of the patrol to the spot. In any case they would not let the stranger go. But I did not want the stranger hurt, not just yet, murmured Chauvelin savagely, but there you've done your best. The fates grant that I may not be too late. We met 6 men just now who have been patrolling this road for several hours. Well? They have seen no stranger either. Yet he is on ahead somewhere in a cart or else. Here. There is not a moment to lose. How far is that hut from here? About a couple of leagues, citoyen. You can find it again, at once, without hesitation? I have absolutely no doubt, citoyen. The footpath to the edge of the cliff? Even in the dark? It is not a dark night, citoyen, and I know I can find my way, repeated the soldier firmly. Fall in behind then. Let your comrade take both your horses back to Calais. You won't want them. Keep beside the cart, and direct the Jew to drive straight ahead. Then stop him within a quarter of a league of the footpath. See that he takes the most direct road. Whilst Chauvelin spoke, Desgas and his men were fast approaching, and Marguerite could hear their footsteps within 100 yards behind her now. She thought it unsafe to stay where she was, and unnecessary too, as she had heard enough. She seemed suddenly to have lost all faculty even for suffering. Her heart, her nerves, her brain seemed to have become numb after all these hours of ceaseless anguish, culminating in this awful despair. For now there was absolutely not the faintest hope. Within 2 short leagues of this spot, the fugitives were waiting for their brave deliverer. He was on his way somewhere on this lonely road, and presently he would join them. Then the well-laid trap would close. 24 men, led by one whose hatred was as deadly as his cunning was malicious, would close round the small band of fugitives and their daring leader. They would all be captured. Armand, according to Chauvelin's pledged word, would be restored to her, but her husband, Percy, whom with every breath she drew she seemed to love and worship more and more, he would fall into the hands of a remorseless enemy, who had no pity for a brave heart, no admiration for the courage of a noble soul, who would show nothing but hatred for the cunning antagonist, who had baffled him so long. She heard the soldier giving a few brief directions to the Jew, then she retired quickly to the edge of the road, and cowered behind some low shrubs, whilst Desgas and his men came up. All fell in noiselessly behind the cart, and slowly they all started down the dark road. Marguerite waited until she reckoned that they were well outside the range of earshot, then she too in the darkness, which suddenly seemed to have become more intense, crept noiselessly along. Chapter 28. The Père Blanchard's Hut. As in a dream, Marguerite followed on. The web was drawing more and more tightly every moment round the beloved life, which had become dearer than all. To see her husband once again, to tell him how she had suffered, how much she had wronged, and how little understood him, had become now her only aim. She had abandoned all hope of saving him. She saw him gradually hemmed in on all sides, and in despair she gazed round her into the darkness, and wondered whence he would presently come, to fall into the death trap which his relentless enemy had prepared for him. The distant roar of the waves now made her shudder. The occasional dismal cry of an owl or a seagull filled her with unspeakable horror. She thought of the ravenous beasts, in human shape, who lay in wait for their prey and destroyed them as mercilessly as any hungry wolf, for the satisfaction of their own appetite of hate. Marguerite was not afraid of the darkness, she only feared that man on ahead, who was sitting at the bottom of a rough wooden cart, nursing thoughts of vengeance, which would have made the very demons in hell chuckle with delight. Her feet were sore. Her knees shook under her from sheer bodily fatigue. 4 days now she had lived in a wild turmoil of excitement. She had not had a quiet rest for 3 nights. Now she had walked on a slippery road for nearly 2 hours, and yet her determination never swerved for a moment. She would see her husband, tell him all, and if he was ready to forgive the crime, which she had committed in her blind ignorance, she would yet have the happiness of dying by his side. She must have walked on almost in a trance, instinct alone keeping her up, and guiding her in the wake of the enemy, when suddenly her ears, attuned to the slightest sound by that same blind instinct, told her that the cart had stopped, and that the soldiers had halted. They had come to their destination. No doubt on the right, somewhere close ahead, was the footpath that led to the edge of the cliff and to the hut. Heedless of any risks, she crept quite close up to where Chauvelin stood, surrounded by his little troop. He had descended from the cart and was giving some orders to the men. These she wanted to hear. What little chance she yet had of being useful to Percy consisted in hearing absolutely every word of his enemy's plans. The spot where all the party had halted must have lain some 800 meters from the coast. The sound of the sea came only very faintly as from a distance. Chauvelin and Desgas, followed by the soldiers, had turned off sharply to the right of the road, apparently onto the footpath which led to the cliffs. The Jew had remained on the road with his cart and nag. Marguerite, with infinite caution and literally crawling on her hands and knees, had also turned off to the right. To accomplish this she had to creep through the rough, low shrubs, trying to make as little noise as possible as she went along, tearing her face and hands against the dry twigs, intent only upon hearing without being seen or heard. Fortunately, as is usual in this part of France, the footpath was bordered by a low, rough hedge, beyond which was a dry ditch filled with coarse grass. In this Marguerite managed to find shelter. She was quite hidden from view, yet could contrive to get within 3 yards of where Chauvelin stood, giving orders to his men. "Now," he was saying in a low and peremptory whisper, "where is the Père Blanchard's hut?" "About 800 meters from here along the footpath," said the soldier who had lately been directing the party, "and halfway down the cliff." "Very good. You shall lead us. Before we begin to descend the cliff, you shall creep down to the hut as noiselessly as possible, and ascertain if the traitor royalists are there. Do you understand?" "I understand, citoyen." "Now listen very attentively, all of you," continued Chauvelin impressively and addressing the soldiers collectively, "for after this we may not be able to exchange another word, so remember every syllable I utter, as if your very lives depended on your memory." "Perhaps they do," he added drily. "We listen, citoyen," said Desgas, "and a soldier of the Republic never forgets an order. You who have crept up to the hut will try to peep inside. If an Englishman is there with those traitors, a man who is tall above the average, or who stoops as if he would disguise his height, then give a sharp, quick whistle as a signal to your comrades. All of you," he added, once more speaking to the soldiers collectively, "then quickly surround and rush into the hut, and each seize one of the men there before they have time to draw their firearms. If any of them struggle, shoot at their legs or arms, but on no account kill the tall man. Do you understand?" "We understand, citoyen." "The man who is tall above the average is probably also strong above the average. It will take 4 or 5 of you at least to overpower him." There was a little pause, then Chauvelin continued. "If the royalist traitors are still alone, which is more than likely to be the case, then warn your comrades who are lying in wait there, and all of you creep and take cover behind the rocks and boulders round the hut, and wait there in dead silence until the tall Englishman arrives. Then only rush the hut when he is safely within its doors. But remember that you must be as silent as the wolf is at night, when he prowls around the pens. I do not wish those royalists to be on the alert. The firing of a pistol, a shriek or call on their part would be sufficient, perhaps, to warn the tall personage to keep clear of the cliffs and of the hut, and," he added emphatically, "it is the tall Englishman whom it is your duty to capture tonight. You shall be implicitly obeyed, citoyen. Then get along as noiselessly as possible, and I will follow you." "What about the Jew, citoyen?" asked Desgas as silently like noiseless shadows. One by one the soldiers began to creep along the rough and narrow footpath. "Ah yes, I had forgotten the Jew," said Chauvelin, and turning towards the Jew, he called him peremptorily. "Here you. Aaron, Moses, Abraham, or whatever your confounded name may be," he said to the old man, who had quietly stood beside his lean nag as far away from the soldiers as possible. "Benjamin Rosenbaum, so it please your honor," he replied humbly. "It does not please me to hear your voice, but it does please me to give you certain orders, which you will find it wise to obey. So it please your honor. Hold your confounded tongue. You shall stay here, do you hear?" with your horse and cart until our return. You are on no account to utter the faintest sound, or even to breathe louder than you can help, nor are you on any consideration whatever to leave your post, until I give you orders to do so. Do you understand? But your honor, protested the Jew pitiably. There is no question of but or of any argument, said Chauvelin, in a tone that made the timid old man tremble from head to foot. If, when I return, I do not find you here, I most solemnly assure you that, wherever you may try to hide yourself, I can find you, and that punishment swift, sure and terrible, will sooner or later overtake you. Do you hear me? But your excellency. I said, do you hear me? The soldiers had all crept away. The three men stood alone together in the dark and lonely road, with Marguerite there behind the hedge, listening to Chauvelin's orders as she would to her own death sentence. I heard your honor, protested the Jew again, while he tried to draw nearer to Chauvelin, and I swear by Abraham, Isaac and Jacob that I would obey your honor most absolutely, and that I would not move from this place until your honor once more deigned to shed the light of your countenance upon your humble servant. But remember, your honor, I am a poor old man, my nerves are not as strong as those of a young soldier. If midnight marauders should come prowling round this lonely road, I might scream or run in my fright. And is my life to be forfeit? Is some terrible punishment to come on my poor old head for that which I cannot help? The Jew seemed in real distress. He was shaking from head to foot. Clearly he was not the man to be left by himself on this lonely road. The man spoke truly. He might unwittingly, in sheer terror, utter the shriek that might prove a warning to the wily Scarlet Pimpernel. Chauvelin reflected for a moment. Will your horse and cart be safe alone here, do you think? He asked roughly. I fancy, citoyen, here interposed Desgas, that they will be safer without that dirty, cowardly Jew than with him. There seems no doubt that if he gets scared, he will either make a bolt of it or shriek his head off. But what am I to do with the brute? Will you send him back to Calais, citoyen? No, for we shall want him to drive back the wounded presently, said Chauvelin, with grim significance. There was a pause again, Desgas waiting for the decision of his chief, and the old Jew whining beside his nag. Well, you lazy, lumbering old coward, said Chauvelin at last, you had better shuffle along behind us. Here, citoyen Desgas, tie this handkerchief tightly round the fellow's mouth. Chauvelin handed a scarf to Desgas, who solemnly began winding it round the Jew's mouth. Meekly Benjamin Rosenbaum allowed himself to be gagged. He evidently preferred this uncomfortable state to that of being left alone, on the dark St. Martin road. Then the three men fell in line. Quick, said Chauvelin impatiently, we have already wasted much valuable time. And the firm footsteps of Chauvelin and Desgas, the shuffling gait of the old Jew, soon died away along the footpath. Marguerite had not lost a single one of Chauvelin's words of command. Her every nerve was strained to completely grasp the situation first, then to make a final appeal to those wits which had so often been called the sharpest in Europe, and which alone might be of service now. Certainly the situation was desperate enough. A tiny band of unsuspecting men, quietly awaiting the arrival of their rescuer, who was equally unconscious of the trap laid for them all. It seemed so horrible, this net, as it were drawn in a circle at dead of night, on a lonely beach, round a few defenseless men, defenseless because they were tricked and unsuspecting. Of these one was the husband she idolized, another the brother she loved. She vaguely wondered who the others were, who were also calmly waiting for the Scarlet Pimpernel, while death lurked behind every boulder of the cliffs. For the moment she could do nothing but follow the soldiers and Chauvelin. She feared to lose her way, or she would have rushed forward and found that wooden hut, and perhaps been in time to warn the fugitives and their brave deliverer yet. For a second, the thought flashed through her mind of uttering the piercing shrieks, which Chauvelin seemed to dread, as a possible warning to the Scarlet Pimpernel and his friends, in the wild hope that they would hear, and have yet time to escape before it was too late. But she did not know how far from the edge of the cliff she was. She did not know if her shrieks would reach the ears of the doomed men. Her effort might be premature, and she would never be allowed to make another. Her mouth would be securely gagged, like that of the Jew, and she, a helpless prisoner in the hands of Chauvelin's men. Like a ghost she flitted noiselessly behind that hedge. She had taken her shoes off, and her stockings were by now torn off her feet. She felt neither soreness nor weariness, indomitable will to reach her husband in spite of adverse fate, and of a cunning enemy, killed all sense of bodily pain within her, and rendered her instincts doubly acute. She heard nothing save the soft and measured footsteps of Percy's enemies on in front. She saw nothing but, in her mind's eye, that wooden hut, and he, her husband, walking blindly to his doom. Suddenly, Those same keen instincts within her made her pause in her mad haste, and cower still further within the shadow of the hedge. The moon, which had proved a friend to her by remaining hidden behind a bank of clouds, now emerged in all the glory of an early autumn night, and in a moment flooded the weird and lonely landscape with a rush of brilliant light. There, not 200 meters ahead, was the edge of the cliff, and below, stretching far away to free and happy England, the sea rolled on smoothly and peaceably. Marguerite's gaze rested for an instant on the brilliant, silvery waters, and as she gazed, her heart, which had been numb with pain for all these hours, seemed to soften and distend, and her eyes filled with hot tears. Not 3 miles away, with white sails set, a graceful schooner lay in wait. Marguerite had guessed rather than recognized her. It was the Daydream, Percy's favorite yacht, with old Briggs, that prince of skippers, aboard, and all her crew of British sailors. Her white sails, glistening in the moonlight, seemed to convey a message to Marguerite of joy and hope, which yet she feared could never be. She waited there, out at sea, waited for her master, like a beautiful white bird all ready to take flight, and he would never reach her, never see her smooth deck again, never gaze any more on the white cliffs of England, the land of liberty and of hope. The sight of the schooner seemed to infuse into the poor, wearied woman the superhuman strength of despair. There was the edge of the cliff, and some way below was the hut, where presently her husband would meet his death. But the moon was out, she could see her way now, she would see the hut from a distance, run to it, rouse them all, warn them at any rate to be prepared and to sell their lives dearly, rather than be caught like so many rats in a hole. She stumbled on behind the hedge in the low, thick grass of the ditch. She must have run on very fast and had outdistanced Chauvelin and Desgas, for presently she reached the edge of the cliff, and heard their footsteps distinctly behind her. But only a very few yards away, and now the moonlight was full upon her. Her figure must have been distinctly silhouetted against the silvery background of the sea. Only for a moment, though, the next she had cowered, like some animal doubled up within itself. She peeped down the great rugged cliffs. The descent would be easy enough, as they were not precipitous, and the great boulders afforded plenty of foothold. Suddenly, as she gazed, she saw at some little distance on her left, and about midway down the cliffs, a rough wooden construction, through the walls of which a tiny red light glimmered like a beacon. Her very heart seemed to stand still, the eagerness of joy was so great that it felt like an awful pain. She could not gauge how distant the hut was, but without hesitation she began the steep descent, creeping from boulder to boulder, caring nothing for the enemy behind or for the soldiers, who evidently had all taken cover since the tall Englishman had not yet appeared. On she pressed, forgetting the deadly foe on her track, running, stumbling, footsore, half-dazed, but still on. When, suddenly, a crevice or stone or slippery bit of rock threw her violently to the ground. She struggled again to her feet and started running forward once more to give them that timely warning, to beg them to flee before he came, and to tell him to keep away, away from this death trap, away from this awful doom. But now she realized that other steps, quicker than her own, were already close at her heels. The next instant a hand dragged at her skirt, and she was down on her knees again, while something was wound round her mouth to prevent her uttering a scream. Bewildered, half frantic with the bitterness of disappointment, she looked round her helplessly, and bending down quite close to her, she saw through the mist, which seemed to gather round her, a pair of keen, malicious eyes, which appeared to her excited brain to have a weird, supernatural green light in them. She lay in the shadow of a great boulder. Chauvelin could not see her features, but he passed his thin, white fingers over her face. "A woman," he whispered, "by all the saints in the calendar. We cannot let her loose, that's certain," he muttered to himself. "I wonder now." Suddenly he paused, and after a few seconds of deadly silence, he gave forth a long, low, curious chuckle, while once again Marguerite felt, with a horrible shudder, his thin fingers wandering over her face. "Dear me," he whispered with affected gallantry, "this is indeed a charming surprise," and Marguerite felt her resistless hand raised to Chauvelin's thin, mocking lips. The situation was indeed grotesque, had it not been at the same time so fearfully tragic. The poor, weary woman, broken in spirit, and half frantic with the bitterness of her disappointment, receiving on her knees the banal gallantries of her deadly enemy. Her senses were leaving her. Half choked with the tight grip round her mouth, she had no strength to move or to utter the faintest sound. The excitement which all along had kept up her delicate body seemed at once to have subsided, and the feeling of blank despair to have completely paralyzed her brain and nerves. Chauvelin must have given some directions, which she was too dazed to hear, for she felt herself lifted from off her feet. The bandage round her mouth was made more secure, and a pair of strong arms carried her towards that tiny red light on ahead, which she had looked upon as a beacon and the last faint glimmer of hope. Chapter 29. Trap. She did not know how long she was thus carried along. She had lost all notion of time and space, and for a few seconds tired nature mercifully deprived her of consciousness. When she once more realized her state, she felt that she was placed with some degree of comfort upon a man's coat, with her back resting against a fragment of rock. The moon was hidden again behind some clouds, and the darkness seemed in comparison more intense. The sea was roaring some 200 feet below her, and on looking all round she could no longer see any vestige of the tiny glimmer of red light. That the end of the journey had been reached, she gathered from the fact that she heard rapid questions and answers spoken in a whisper quite close to her. "There are 4 men in there, citoyenne. They are sitting by the fire and seem to be waiting quietly. The hour? Nearly 2 o'clock. The tide? Coming in quickly. The schooner? Obviously an English one lying some 3 kilometers out. But we cannot see her boat. Have the men taken cover? Yes, citoyenne. They will not blunder? They will not stir until the tall Englishman comes, then they will surround and overpower the 5 men. Right. And the lady? Still dazed, I fancy. She's close beside you, citoyenne. And the Jew? He's gagged and his legs strapped together. He cannot move or scream. Good. Then have your gun ready in case you want it. Get close to the hut and leave me to look after the lady." Desgas evidently obeyed, for Marguerite heard him creeping away along the stony cliff. Then she felt that a pair of warm, thin, talon-like hands took hold of both her own, and held them in a grip of steel. "Before that handkerchief is removed from your pretty mouth, fair lady," whispered Chauvelin close to her ear, "I think it right to give you one small word of warning. What has procured me the honor of being followed across the channel by so charming a companion, I cannot of course conceive, but if I mistake not, the purpose of this flattering attention is not one that would commend itself to my vanity, and I think that I am right in surmising, moreover, that the first sound which your pretty lips would utter, as soon as the cruel gag is removed, would be one that would perhaps prove a warning to the cunning fox, which I have been at such pains to track, to his lair." He paused a moment, while the steel-like grasp seemed to tighten round her wrist, then he resumed in the same hurried whisper. "Inside that hut, if again I am not mistaken, your brother Armand St. just waits with that traitor de Tournay, and 2 other men unknown to you, for the arrival of the mysterious rescuer, whose identity has for so long puzzled our Committee of Public Safety, the audacious Scarlet Pimpernel. No doubt if you scream, if there is a scuffle here, if shots are fired, it is more than likely that the same long legs that brought this scarlet enigma here, will as quickly take him to some place of safety. The purpose then, for which I have traveled all these miles, will remain unaccomplished. On the other hand, it only rests with yourself that your brother, Armand, shall be free to go off with you tonight if you like, to England, or any other place of safety." Marguerite could not utter a sound, as the handkerchief was wound very tightly round her mouth, but Chauvelin was peering through the darkness very closely into her face. No doubt too her hand gave a responsive appeal to his last suggestion, for presently he continued. "What I want you to do to ensure Armand's safety is a very simple thing, dear lady." "What is it?" Marguerite's hand seemed to convey to his in response. "To remain, on this spot, without uttering a sound, until I give you leave to speak." "But I think you will obey," he added, with that funny dry chuckle of his as Marguerite's whole figure seemed to stiffen, in defiance of this order, "for let me tell you that if you scream nay, if you utter one sound or attempt to move from here, my men, there are 30 of them about, will see street just de Tournay and their 2 friends and shoot them here, by my orders, before your eyes." Marguerite had listened to her implacable enemy's speech with ever-increasing terror. Numbed with physical pain, she yet had sufficient mental vitality in her to realize the full horror of this terrible either, or he was once more putting before her, an either, or 10,000 times more appalling and horrible, than the one he had suggested to her that fatal night at the ball. This time it meant that she should keep still and allow the husband she worshipped to walk unconsciously to his death, or that she should, by trying to give him a word of warning, which perhaps might even be unavailing, actually give the signal for her own brother's death, and that of 3 other unsuspecting men. She could not see Chauvelin, but she could almost feel those keen pale eyes of his fixed maliciously upon her helpless form, and his hurried whispered words reached her ear, as the death knell of her last faint, lingering hope. "Nay, fair lady," he added urbanely, "you can have no interest in anyone save in Saint Just, and all you need do for his safety is to remain where you are and to keep silent." My men have strict orders to spare him in every way. As for that enigmatic Scarlet Pimpernel, what is he to you? Believe me, no warning from you could possibly save him. And now, dear lady, let me remove this unpleasant coercion, which has been placed before your pretty mouth. You see, I wish you to be perfectly free in the choice which you are about to make. Her thoughts in a whirl, her temples aching, her nerves paralyzed, her body numb with pain, Marguerite sat there in the darkness which surrounded her as with a pall. From where she sat she could not see the sea, but she heard the incessant mournful murmur of the incoming tide, which spoke of her dead hopes, her lost love, the husband she had with her own hand betrayed and sent to his death. Chauvelin removed the handkerchief from her mouth. She certainly did not scream. At that moment she had no strength to do anything but barely to hold herself upright, and to force herself to think of what she should do. The minutes flew on. In this awful stillness she could not tell how fast or how slowly. She heard nothing, she saw nothing. She did not feel the sweet-smelling autumn air, scented with the briny odor of the sea. She no longer heard the murmur of the waves, the occasional rattling of a pebble as it rolled down some steep incline. More and more unreal did the whole situation seem. It was impossible that she, Marguerite Blakeney, the Queen of London society, should actually be sitting here on this bit of lonely coast, in the middle of the night, side by side with a most bitter enemy, and oh! It was not possible that somewhere, not many hundred feet away perhaps from where she stood, the being she had once despised, but who now, in every moment of this weird dreamlike life became more and more dear, it was not possible that he was unconsciously, even now walking to his doom, whilst she did nothing to save him. Why did she not with unearthly screams, that would re-echo from one end of the lonely beach to the other, send out a warning to him to desist, to retrace his steps, for death lurked here whilst he advanced. Once or twice the screams rose to her throat, as if by instinct. Then before her eyes there stood the awful alternative. Her brother and those 3 men shot before her eyes, practically by her orders, she their murderer. That fiend in human shape next to her knew human female nature well. He had played upon her feelings as a skillful musician plays upon an instrument. He had gauged her very thoughts to a nicety. She could not give that signal, for she was weak and she was a woman. How could she deliberately order Armand to be shot before her eyes, to have his dear blood upon her head, he dying perhaps with a curse on her, upon his lips? And little Suzanne's father too. He an old man and the others, oh, it was all too horrible. Wait. How long? The early morning hours sped on, and yet it was not dawn. The sea continued its incessant mournful murmur, the autumnal breeze sighed gently in the night. The lonely beach was silent, even as the grave. Suddenly from somewhere not very far away, a cheerful, strong voice was heard singing, "God Save the King." Chapter 30. The schooner. Marguerite's aching heart stood still. She felt, more than she heard, the men on the watch preparing for the fight. Her senses told her that each, with sword in hand, was crouching ready for the spring. The voice came nearer and nearer. In the vast immensity of these lonely cliffs, with the loud murmur of the sea below, it was impossible to say how near or how far, nor yet from which direction came that cheerful singer, who sang to God to save his king, whilst he himself was in such deadly danger. Faint at first, the voice grew louder and louder. From time to time a small pebble detached itself apparently from beneath the firm tread of the singer, and went rolling down the rocky cliffs to the beach below. Marguerite, as she heard, felt that her very life was slipping away, as if when that voice drew nearer, when that singer became entrapped. She distinctly heard the click of Desca's gun close to her. No. O God in heaven! This cannot be. Let Armand's blood then be upon her own head. Let her be branded as his murderer. Let even he whom she loved, despise and loathe her for this, but God, O God, save him at any cost. With a wild shriek, she sprang to her feet and darted round the rock, against which she had been cowering. She saw the little red gleam through the chinks of the hut. She ran up to it and fell against its wooden walls, which she began to hammer with clenched fists in an almost maniacal frenzy, while she shouted, Armand, for God's sake fire. Your leader is near. He is coming. He is betrayed. Armand, fire in heaven's name. She was seized and thrown to the ground. She lay there moaning, bruised, not caring, but still half sobbing, half shrieking. Percy, my husband, for God's sake fly. Armand, why don't you fire? One of you stop that woman screaming, hissed Chauvelin, who hardly could refrain from striking her. Something was thrown over her face. She could not breathe and perforce she was silent. The bold singer too had become silent, warned, no doubt, of his impending danger by Marguerite's frantic shrieks. The men had sprung to their feet. There was no need for further silence on their part. The very cliffs echoed the poor heartbroken woman's screams. Chauvelin, with a muttered oath, which boded no good to her, who had dared to upset his most cherished plans, had hastily shouted the word of command. "Into it, my men, and let no one escape from that hut alive." The moon had once more emerged from between the clouds. The darkness on the cliffs had gone, giving place once more to brilliant, silvery light. Some of the soldiers had rushed to the rough, wooden door of the hut, whilst one of them kept guard over Marguerite. The door was partially open. One of the soldiers pushed it further, but within all was darkness, the charcoal fire only lighting with a dim red light the furthest corner of the hut. The soldiers paused automatically at the door, like machines waiting for further orders. Chauvelin, who was prepared for a violent onslaught from within, and for a vigorous resistance from the four fugitives, under cover of the darkness, was for the moment paralyzed with astonishment when he saw the soldiers standing there at attention, like sentries on guard, whilst not a sound proceeded from the hut. Filled with strange, anxious foreboding, he too went to the door of the hut, and peering into the gloom he asked quickly, "What is the meaning of this?" "I think, citoyen, that there is no one there now," replied one of the soldiers imperturbably. "You have not let those 4 men go?" thundered Chauvelin menacingly. "I ordered you to let no man escape alive. Quick after them, all of you. Quick in every direction." The men, obedient as machines, rushed down the rocky incline towards the beach, some going off to right and left, as fast as their feet could carry them. "You and your men will pay with your lives for this blunder, citoyen sergeant," said Chauvelin viciously to the sergeant who had been in charge of the men. "And you too, citoyen," he added, turning with a snarl to Desgas, "for disobeying my orders. You ordered us to wait, citoyen, until the tall Englishman arrived and joined the 4 men in the hut." "No one came," said the sergeant sullenly. "But I ordered you just now, when the woman screamed, to rush in and let no one escape." "But, citoyen, the 4 men who were there before had been gone some time, I think." "You think? You?" said Chauvelin, almost choking with fury, "and you let them go." "You ordered us to wait, citoyen," protested the sergeant, "and to implicitly obey your commands on pain of death." "We waited. I heard the men creep out of the hut, not many minutes after we took cover, and long before the woman screamed," he added, as Chauvelin seemed still quite speechless with rage. "Hark!" said Desgas suddenly. In the distance the sound of repeated firing was heard. Chauvelin tried to peer along the beach below, but as luck would have it, the fitful moon once more hid her light behind a bank of clouds, and he could see nothing. "One of you go into the hut and strike a light," he stammered at last. Stolidly the sergeant obeyed. He went up to the charcoal fire and lit the small lantern he carried in his belt. It was evident that the hut was quite empty. "Which way did they go?" asked Chauvelin. "I could not tell, citoyen," said the sergeant. "They went straight down the cliff first, then disappeared behind some boulders." "Hush! What was that?" All 3 men listened attentively. In the far, very far distance, could be heard faintly echoing and already dying away, the quick, sharp splash of half a dozen oars. Chauvelin took out his handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "The schooner's boat," was all he gasped. "Evidently Armand St. Just and his 3 companions had managed to creep along the side of the cliffs, whilst the men, like true soldiers of the well-drilled Republican army, had with blind obedience and in fear of their lives, implicitly obeyed Chauvelin's orders, to wait for the tall Englishman who was the important capture. They had no doubt reached one of the creeks which jet far out to sea on this coast at intervals. Behind this, the boat of the Daydream must have been on the lookout for them, and they were by now safely on board the British schooner. As if to confirm this last supposition, the dull boom of a gun was heard from out at sea. "The schooner, citoyen," said Desgas quietly, "she's off." It needed all Chauvelin's nerve and presence of mind not to give way to a useless and undignified access of rage. There was no doubt now that once again, that accursed British head had completely outwitted him. How he had contrived to reach the hut, without being seen by one of the 30 soldiers who guarded the spot, was more than Chauvelin could conceive. That he had done so before the 30 men had arrived on the cliff was of course fairly clear, but how he had come over in Reuben Goldstein's cart, all the way from Calais, without being sighted by the various patrols on duty was impossible of explanation. It really seemed as if some potent fate watched over that daring Scarlet Pimpernel, and his astute enemy almost felt a superstitious shudder pass through him, as he looked round at the towering cliffs, and the loneliness of this outlying coast. But surely this was reality. In the year of grace 1792, there were no fairies and hobgoblins about. Chauvelin and his 30 men had all heard with their own ears that accursed voice singing "God Save the King," fully 20 minutes after they had all taken cover around the hut. By that time the 4 fugitives must have reached the creek and got into the boat, and the nearest creek was more than a mile from the hut. Where had that daring singer got to? Unless Satan himself had lent him wings, he could not have covered that mile on a rocky cliff in the space of 2 minutes, and only 2 minutes had elapsed between his song and the sound of the boat's oars away at sea. He must have remained behind and was even now hiding somewhere about the cliffs. The patrols were still about, he would still be sighted, no doubt. Chauvelin felt hopeful once again. 1 or 2 of the men who had run after the fugitives were now slowly working their way up the cliff. One of them reached Chauvelin's side at the very moment that this hope arose in the astute diplomatist's heart. "We were too late, citoyen," the soldier said. "We reached the beach just before the moon was hidden by that bank of clouds. The boat had undoubtedly been on the lookout behind that first creek, a mile off, but she had shoved off some time ago when we got to the beach and was already some way out to sea. We fired after her, but of course it was no good. She was making straight and quickly for the schooner. We saw her very clearly in the moonlight." "Yes," said Chauvelin with eager impatience. "She had shoved off some time ago, you said, and the nearest creek is a mile further on." "Yes, citoyen. I ran all the way straight to the beach, though I guess the boat would have waited somewhere near the creek as the tide would reach there earliest. The boat must have shoved off some minutes before the woman began to scream." Some minutes before the woman began to scream. Then Chauvelin's hopes had not deceived him. The Scarlet Pimpernel may have contrived to send the fugitives on ahead by the boat, but he himself had not had time to reach it. He was still on shore and all the roads were well patrolled. At any rate, all was not yet lost and would not be, whilst that impudent Britisher was still on French soil. "Bring the light in here," he commanded eagerly as he once more entered the hut. The sergeant brought his lantern, and together the 2 men explored the little place. With a rapid glance Chauvelin noted its contents. The cauldron placed close under an aperture in the wall, and containing the last few dying embers of burned charcoal, a couple of stools, overturned as if in the haste of sudden departure, then the fisherman's tools and his nets lying in one corner, and beside them, something small and white. "Pick that up," said Chauvelin to the sergeant, pointing to this white scrap, "and bring it to me." It was a crumpled piece of paper, evidently forgotten there by the fugitives in their hurry to get away. The sergeant, much awed by the citoyen's obvious rage and impatience, picked the paper up and handed it respectfully to Chauvelin. "Read it, sergeant," said the latter curtly. "It is almost illegible, citoyen, a fearful scrawl." "I ordered you to read it," repeated Chauvelin viciously. The sergeant, by the light of his lantern, began deciphering the few hastily scrawled words. "I cannot quite reach you without risking your lives and endangering the success of your rescue. When you receive this, wait 2 minutes, then creep out of the hut one by one, turn to your left sharply, and creep cautiously down the cliff. Keep to the left all the time till you reach the first rock, which you see jutting far out to sea. Behind it in the creek the boat is on the lookout for you. Give a long sharp whistle. She will come up. Get into her. My men will row you to the schooner and thence to England in safety. Once on board the Daydream, send the boat back for me. Tell my men that I shall be at the creek, which is in a direct line opposite the Chat Gris near Calais. They know it. I shall be there as soon as possible. They must wait for me at a safe distance out at sea, till they hear the usual signal. Do not delay, and obey these instructions implicitly. Then there is the signature, citoyen," added the sergeant as he handed the paper back to Chauvelin. But the latter had not waited an instant. One phrase of the momentous scrawl had caught his ear. "I shall be at the creek which is in a direct line opposite the Chat Gris near Calais." That phrase might yet mean victory for him. "Which of you knows this coast well?" he shouted to his men, who now one by one had all returned from their fruitless run, and were all assembled once more round the hut. "I do, citoyen," said one of them. "I was born in Calais and know every stone of these cliffs." "There is a creek in a direct line from the Chat Gris?" "There is, citoyen. I know it well. The Englishman is hoping to reach that creek. He does not know every stone of these cliffs. He may go there by the longest way round, and in any case he will proceed cautiously for fear of the patrols. At any rate, there is a chance to get him yet. 1,000 francs to each man who gets to that creek before that long-legged Englishman." "I know a short cut across the cliffs," said the soldier, and with an enthusiastic shout, he rushed forward, followed closely by his comrades. Within a few minutes their running footsteps had died away in the distance. Chauvelin listened to them for a moment. The promise of the reward was lending spurs to the soldiers of the Republic. The gleam of hate and anticipated triumph was once more apparent on his face. Close to him Desgas still stood mute and impassive, waiting for further orders, whilst two soldiers were kneeling beside the prostrate form of Marguerite. Chauvelin gave his secretary a vicious look. His well-laid plan had failed, its sequel was problematical. There was still a great chance now that the Scarlet Pimpernel might yet escape, and Chauvelin, with that unreasoning fury, which sometimes assails a strong nature, was longing to vent his rage on somebody. The soldiers were holding Marguerite pinioned to the ground, though she, poor soul, was not making the faintest struggle. Overwrought nature had at last peremptorily asserted herself, and she lay there in a dead swoon, her eyes circled by deep purple lines that told of long sleepless nights, her hair matted and damp round her forehead, her lips parted in a sharp curve that spoke of physical pain. The cleverest woman in Europe, the elegant and fashionable Lady Blakeney, who had dazzled London society with her beauty, her wit and her extravagances, presented a very pathetic picture of tired-out, suffering womanhood, which would have appealed to any but the hard, vengeful heart of her baffled enemy. "It is no use mounting guard over a woman who is half dead," he said spitefully to the soldiers, "when you have allowed 5 men who were very much alive to escape." Obediently the soldiers rose to their feet. "You'd better try and find that footpath again for me, and that broken-down cart we left on the road." Then suddenly a bright idea seemed to strike him. By the by, where is the Jew?" "Close by here, citoyen," said Desgas. "I gagged him and tied his legs together as you commanded." From the immediate vicinity, a plaintive moan reached Chauvelin's ears. He followed his secretary, who led the way to the other side of the hut, where, fallen into an absolute heap of dejection, with his legs tightly pinioned together and his mouth gagged, lay the unfortunate descendant of Israel. His face in the silvery light of the moon looked positively ghastly with terror. His eyes were wide open and almost glassy, and his whole body was trembling as if with ague, while a piteous wail escaped his bloodless lips. The rope which had originally been wound round his shoulders and arms had evidently given way, for it lay in a tangle about his body, but he seemed quite unconscious of this, for he had not made the slightest attempt to move from the place where Desgas had originally put him. Like a terrified chicken which looks upon a line of white chalk, drawn on a table as on a string which paralyzes its movements. "Bring the cowardly brute here," commanded Chauvelin. He certainly felt exceedingly vicious, and since he had no reasonable grounds for venting his ill humor on the soldiers who had but too punctually obeyed his orders, he felt that the son of the despised race would prove an excellent butt. With true French contempt of the Jew, which has survived the lapse of centuries even to this day, he would not go too near him, but said with biting sarcasm, as the wretched old man was brought in full light of the moon by the two soldiers, "I suppose now that being a Jew you have a good memory for bargains? Answer," he again commanded, as the Jew with trembling lips seemed too frightened to speak. "Yes, your honor," stammered the poor wretch. "You remember, then, the one you and I made together in Calais, when you undertook to overtake Reuben Goldstein, his nag and my friend the tall stranger?" But, your honor." "There is no but," I said. "Do you remember?" Why, yes, your honor." "What was the bargain?" There was dead silence. The unfortunate man looked round at the great cliffs, the moon above, the stolid faces of the soldiers, and even at the poor, prostrate, inanimate woman close by, but said nothing. "Will you speak?" thundered Chauvelin menacingly. He did try, poor wretch, but obviously he could not. There was no doubt, however, that he knew what to expect from the stern man before him. "Your honor," he ventured imploringly. "Since your terror seems to have paralyzed your tongue," said Chauvelin sarcastically, "I must needs refresh your memory. It was agreed between us, that if we overtook my friend the tall stranger before he reached this place, you were to have 10 pieces of gold." A low moan escaped from the Jew's trembling lips. "But," added Chauvelin with slow emphasis, "if you deceived me in your promise, you were to have a sound beating, one that would teach you not to tell lies." "I did not, your honor. I swear it by Abraham. And by all the other patriarchs I know. Unfortunately, they are still in Hades, I believe, according to your creed, and cannot help you much in your present trouble. Now, you did not fulfill your share of the bargain, but I am ready to fulfill mine. Here," he added, turning to the soldiers, "the buckle end of your 2 belts to this confounded Jew." As the soldiers obediently unbuckled their heavy leather belts, the Jew set up a howl that surely would have been enough to bring all the patriarchs out of Hades and elsewhere, to defend their descendant from the brutality of this French official. "I think I can rely on you, citoyen soldiers," laughed Chauvelin maliciously, "to give this old liar the best and soundest beating he has ever experienced. But don't kill him," he added drily. "We will obey, citoyen," replied the soldiers as imperturbably as ever. He did not wait to see his orders carried out. He knew that he could trust these soldiers, who were still smarting under his rebuke, not to mince matters when given a free hand to belabor a third party. "When that lumbering coward has had his punishment," he said to Desgas, "the men can guide us as far as the cart, and one of them can drive us in it back to Calais. The Jew and the woman can look after each other," he added roughly, "until we can send somebody for them in the morning. They can't run away very far in their present condition, and we cannot be troubled with them just now." Chauvelin had not given up all hope. His men, he knew, were spurred on by the hope of the reward. That enigmatic and audacious Scarlet Pimpernel, alone and with 30 men at his heels, could not reasonably be expected to escape a second time. But he felt less sure now. The Englishman's audacity had baffled him once, whilst the wooden-headed stupidity of the soldiers, and the interference of a woman had turned his hand, which held all the trumps, into a losing one. If Marguerite had not taken up his time, if the soldiers had had a grain of intelligence, it was a long if, and Chauvelin stood for a moment quite still, and enrolled 30-odd people in one long, overwhelming anathema. Nature, poetic, silent, balmy, the bright moon, the calm, silvery sea spoke of beauty and of rest, and Chauvelin cursed nature, cursed man and woman, and above all, he cursed all long-legged, meddlesome British enigmas with one gigantic curse. The howls of the Jew behind him, undergoing his punishment, sent a bomb through his heart, overburdened as it was with revengeful malice. He smiled. It eased his mind to think that some human being at least was, like himself, not altogether at peace with mankind. He turned and took a last look at the lonely bit of coast, where stood the wooden hut, now bathed in moonlight, the scene of the greatest discomfiture ever experienced by a leading member of the Committee of Public Safety. Against a rock, on a hard bed of stone, lay the unconscious figure of Marguerite Blakeney, while some few paces further on, the unfortunate Jew was receiving on his broad back the blows of 2 stout leather belts, wielded by the stolid arms of 2 sturdy soldiers of the Republic. The howls of Benjamin Rosenbaum were fit to make the dead rise from their graves. They must have wakened all the gulls from sleep, and made them look down with great interest at the doings of the lords of the creation. "That will do," commanded Chauvelin as the Jew's moans became more feeble, and the poor wretch seemed to have fainted away. "We don't want to kill him." Obediently the soldiers buckled on their belts, one of them viciously kicking the Jew to one side. "Leave him there," said Chauvelin, "and lead the way now quickly to the cart. I'll follow." He walked up to where Marguerite lay and looked down into her face. She had evidently recovered consciousness, and was making feeble efforts to raise herself. Her large blue eyes were looking at the moonlit scene round her with a scared and terrified look. They rested with a mixture of horror and pity on the Jew, whose luckless fate and wild howls had been the first signs that struck her, with her returning senses. Then she caught sight of Chauvelin in his neat, dark clothes, which seemed hardly crumpled after the stirring events of the last few hours. He was smiling sarcastically, and his pale eyes peered down at her with a look of intense malice. With mock gallantry, he stooped and raised her icy-cold hand to his lips, which sent a thrill of indescribable loathing through Marguerite's weary frame. "I much regret, fair lady," he said in his most suave tones, "that circumstances, over which I have no control, compel me to leave you here for the moment. But I go away, secure in the knowledge that I do not leave you unprotected. Our friend Benjamin here, though a trifle the worse for wear at the present moment, will prove a gallant defender of your fair person, I have no doubt. At dawn I will send an escort for you. Until then, I feel sure that you will find him devoted, though perhaps a trifle slow." Marguerite only had the strength to turn her head away. Her heart was broken with cruel anguish. One awful thought had returned to her mind, together with gathering consciousness. What had become of Percy? What of Armand? She knew nothing of what had happened after she heard the cheerful song, "God Save the King," which she believed to be the signal of death. "I, myself," concluded Chauvelin, "must now very reluctantly leave you. Au revoir, fair lady. We meet, I hope, soon in London. Shall I see you at the Prince of Wales' garden party? No? Ah, well, au revoir. Remember me, I pray, to Sir Percy Blakeney." And with a last ironical smile and bow, he once more kissed her hand, and disappeared down the footpath in the wake of the soldiers, and followed by the imperturbable Desgas. Chapter 31. The Escape. Marguerite listened, half-dazed as she was, to the fast-retreating, firm footsteps of the four men. All nature was so still that she, lying with her ear close to the ground, could distinctly trace the sound of their tread, as they ultimately turned into the road, and presently the faint echo of the old cart wheels, the halting gait of the lean nag, told her that her enemy was a quarter of a league away. How long she lay there she knew not. She had lost count of time. Dreamily she looked up at the moonlit sky, and listened to the monotonous roll of the waves. The invigorating scent of the sea was nectar to her wearied body, the immensity of the lonely cliffs was silent and dreamlike. Her brain only remained conscious of its ceaseless, its intolerable torture of uncertainty. She did not know. She did not know whether Percy was even now, at this moment, in the hands of the soldiers of the Republic, enduring, as she had done herself, the jibes and jeers of his malicious enemy. She did not know, on the other hand, whether Armand's lifeless body did not lie there, in the hut, whilst Percy had escaped, only to hear that his wife's hands had guided the human bloodhounds to the murder of Armand and his friends. The physical pain of utter weariness was so great, that she hoped confidently her tired body could rest here forever, after all the turmoil, the passion, and the intrigues of the last few days, here, beneath that clear sky, within sound of the sea, and with this balmy autumn breeze whispering to her a last lullaby. All was so solitary, so silent, like unto dreamland. Even the last faint echo of the distant cart had long ago died away, afar. Suddenly, a sound, the strangest, undoubtedly, that these lonely cliffs of France had ever heard, broke the silent solemnity of the shore. So strange a sound was it that the gentle breeze ceased to murmur, the tiny pebbles to roll down the steep incline. So strange that Marguerite, wearied, overwrought as she was, thought that the beneficial unconsciousness of the approach of death was playing her half-sleeping senses a weird and elusive trick. It was the sound of a good, solid, absolutely British dam. The seagulls in their nests awoke and looked round in astonishment. A distant and solitary owl set up a midnight hoot. The tall cliffs frowned down majestically at the strange, unheard-of sacrilege. Marguerite did not trust her ears. Half raising herself on her hands, she strained every sense to see or hear, to know the meaning of this very earthly sound. All was still again for the space of a few seconds. The same silence once more fell upon the great and lonely vastness. Then Marguerite, who had listened as in a trance, who felt she must be dreaming with that cool magnetic moonlight overhead, heard again, and this time her heart stood still, her eyes large and dilated, looked round her, not daring to trust to her other sense. "What's life? But I wish those demmed fellows had not hit quite so hard." This time it was quite unmistakable, only one particular pair of essentially British lips could have uttered those words, in sleepy, drawly, affected tones. "Damn," repeated those same British lips emphatically. "Zounds, but I'm as weak as a rat." In a moment Marguerite was on her feet. Was she dreaming? Were those great stony cliffs the gates of paradise? Was the fragrant breath of the breeze suddenly caused by the flutter of angels' wings, bringing tidings of unearthly joys to her, after all her suffering, or, faint and ill, was she the prey of delirium? She listened again, and once again she heard the same very earthly sounds of good, honest British language, not the least akin to whisperings from paradise or flutter of angels' wings. She looked round her eagerly at the tall cliffs, the lonely hut, the great stretch of rocky beach. Somewhere there, above or below her, behind a boulder or inside a crevice, but still hidden from her longing, feverish eyes, must be the owner of that voice, which once used to irritate her, but which now would make her the happiest woman in Europe, if only she could locate it. "Percy! Percy!" she shrieked hysterically, tortured between doubt and hope. "I am here. Come to me. Where are you? Percy! Percy!" "It's all very well calling me dear," said the same sleepy, drawly voice, "but odds my life I cannot come to you. Those demmed frog-eaters have trussed me like a goose on a spit, and I am as weak as a mouse. I cannot get away." And still Marguerite did not understand. She did not realize for at least another 10 seconds whence came that voice, so drawly, so dear, but alas, with a strange accent of weakness and of suffering. There was no one within sight, except by that rock. Great God! The Jew! Was she mad or dreaming? His back was against the pale moonlight, he was half crouching, trying vainly to raise himself with his arms tightly pinioned. Marguerite ran up to him, took his head in both her hands, and looked straight into a pair of blue eyes, good-natured, even a trifle amused, shining out of the weird and distorted mask of the Jew. "Percy! Percy! My husband!" she gasped, faint with the fullness of her joy. "Thank God! Thank God!" "Law, dear," he rejoined good-humoredly, We will both do that anon, and you think you can loosen these demmed ropes and release me from my inelegant attitude." She had no knife, her fingers were numb and weak, but she worked away with her teeth, while great welcome tears poured from her eyes onto those poor, pinioned hands. "Odds life," he said, when at last, after frantic efforts on her part, the rope seemed at last to be giving way, "but I marvel whether it has ever happened before, that an English gentleman allowed himself to be licked by a demmed foreigner, and made no attempt to give as good as he got." It was very obvious that he was exhausted from sheer physical pain, and when at last the rope gave way, he fell in a heap against the rock. Marguerite looked helplessly round her. "Oh, for a drop of water on this awful beach," she cried in agony, seeing that he was ready to faint again. "Nay, dear," he murmured with his good-humored smile, "personally I should prefer a drop of good French brandy. And you'll dive in the pocket of this dirty old garment, you'll find my flask. I am demmed if I can move." When he had drunk some brandy, he forced Marguerite to do likewise. "Law, that's better now. Little woman," he said with a sigh of satisfaction. "Hi-ho. But this is a queer rig-up for Sir Percy Blakeney Bart, to be found in by his lady and no mistake. Begad," he added, passing his hand over his chin, "I haven't been shaved for nearly 20 hours, I must look a disgusting object. As for these curls—" And laughingly he took off the disfiguring wig and curls, and stretched out his long limbs, which were cramped from many hours stooping. Then he bent forward and looked long and searchingly into his wife's blue eyes. "Percy," she whispered, while a deep blush suffused her delicate cheeks and neck, "if you only knew—" "I do know, dear, everything," he said with infinite gentleness. "And can you ever forgive?" "I have not to forgive, sweetheart. Your heroism, your devotion, which I, alas, so little deserved, have more than atoned for that unfortunate episode at the ball." "Then you knew," she whispered, "all the time?" "Yes," he replied tenderly, "I knew, all the time. But begad, had I but known what a noble heart yours was, my Margot, I should have trusted you as you deserve to be trusted, and you would not have had to undergo the terrible sufferings of the past few hours, in order to run after a husband, who has done so much that needs forgiveness." They were sitting side by side, leaning up against a rock, and he had rested his aching head on her shoulder. She certainly now deserved the name of the happiest woman in Europe. "It is a case of the blind leading the lame, sweetheart, is it not?" he said with his good-natured smile of old. "Odds life. But I do not know which are the more sore, my shoulders or your little feet." He bent forward to kiss them, for they peeped out through her torn stockings, and bore pathetic witness to her endurance and devotion. "But Armand," she said with sudden terror and remorse, as in the midst of her happiness the image of the beloved brother, for whose sake she had so deeply sinned, rose now before her mind. "Oh, have no fear for Armand, sweetheart," he said tenderly. "Did I not pledge you my word that he should be safe? He with de Tournay and the others are even now on board the Daydream." "But how?" she gasped. "I do not understand." "Yet, 'tis simple enough, dear," he said with that funny half-shy, half-inane laugh of his. "You see, when I found that that brute Chauvelin meant to stick to me like a leech, I thought the best thing I could do, as I could not shake him off, was to take him along with me. I had to get to Armand and the others somehow, and all the roads were patrolled and everyone on the lookout for your humble servant. I knew that when I slipped through Chauvelin's fingers at the Chat Gris, that he would lie in wait for me here whichever way I took. I wanted to keep an eye on him and his doings, and a British head is as good as a French one any day." Indeed it had proved to be infinitely better, and Marguerite's heart was filled with joy and marvel, as he continued to recount to her the daring manner in which he had snatched the fugitives away, right from under Chauvelin's very nose. "Dressed as the dirty old Jew," he said gaily, "I knew I should not be recognized. I had met Reuben Goldstein in Calais earlier in the evening. For a few gold pieces he supplied me with this rig-out, and undertook to bury himself out of sight of everybody, whilst he lent me his cart and nag. But if Chauvelin had discovered you," she gasped excitedly, "your disguise was good, but he is so sharp." "Odds fish," he rejoined quietly, "then certainly the game would have been up. I could but take the risk. I know human nature pretty well by now," he added with a note of sadness in his cheery young voice, "and I know these Frenchmen out and out. They so loathe the Jew that they never come nearer than a couple of yards of him, and begad, I fancy that I contrive to make myself look about as loathsome an object as it is possible to conceive." "Yes, and then?" she asked eagerly. "Zooks. Then I carried out my little plan. That is to say, at first I only determined to leave everything to chance, but when I heard Chauvelin giving his orders to the soldiers, I thought that fate and I were going to work together after all. I reckoned on the blind obedience of the soldiers. Chauvelin had ordered them on pain of death not to stir until the tall Englishman came. Desgas had thrown me down in a heap quite close to the hut. The soldiers took no notice of the Jew who had driven citoyen Chauvelin to this spot. I managed to free my hands from the ropes, with which the brute had trussed me. I always carry pencil and paper with me wherever I go, and I hastily scrawled a few important instructions on a scrap of paper. Then I looked about me. I crawled up to the hut, under the very noses of the soldiers, who lay under cover without stirring, just as Chauvelin had ordered them to do. Then I dropped my little note into the hut, through a chink in the wall, and waited. In this note I told the fugitives to walk noiselessly out of the hut, creep down the cliffs, keep to the left until they came to the first creek, to give a certain signal, when the boat of the Daydream, which lay in wait not far out to sea, would pick them up. They obeyed implicitly, fortunately for them and for me. The soldiers who saw them were equally obedient to Chauvelin's orders. They did not stir. I waited for nearly half an hour. When I knew that the fugitives were safe, I gave the signal, which caused so much stir. And that was the whole story. It seems so simple. And Marguerite could but marvel at the wonderful ingenuity, the boundless pluck and audacity which had evolved and helped to carry out this daring plan. But those brutes struck you, she gasped in horror at the bare recollection of the fearful indignity. Well, that could not be helped, he said gently. Whilst my little wife's fate was so uncertain, I had to remain here by her side. Ott's life, he added merrily, never fear. Chauvelin will lose nothing by waiting, I warrant. Wait till I get him back to England. La! He shall pay for the thrashing he gave me with compound interest, I promise you. Marguerite laughed. It was so good to be beside him, to hear his cheery voice, to watch that good-humored twinkle in his blue eyes, as he stretched out his strong arms, in longing for that foe, and anticipation of his well-deserved punishment. Suddenly, however, she started. The happy blush left her cheek, the light of joy died out of her eyes. She had heard a stealthy footfall overhead, and a stone had rolled down from the top of the cliffs right down to the beach below. "What's that?" she whispered in horror and alarm. "Oh, nothing, dear," he muttered with a pleasant laugh, "only a trifle you happen to have forgotten, my friend Fawkes." "Sir Andrew," she gasped. Indeed, she had wholly forgotten the devoted friend and companion, who had trusted and stood by her during all these hours of anxiety and suffering. She remembered him now, tardily and with a pang of remorse. "Why, you had forgotten him, hadn't you, dear?" said Sir Percy merrily. "Fortunately, I met him not far from the Chat Gris, before I had that interesting supper party with my friend Chauvelin. Ott's life. But I have a score to settle with that young reprobate. But in the meanwhile, I told him of a very long, very roundabout road, that would bring him here by a very circuitous road which Chauvelin's men would never suspect, just about the time when we are ready for him, little woman?" "And he obeyed?" asked Marguerite in utter astonishment. "Without word or question. See, here he comes. He was not in the way when I did not want him, and now he arrives in the nick of time. He will make pretty little Suzanne a most admirable and methodical husband." In the meanwhile Sir Andrew Fawkes had cautiously worked his way down the cliffs. He stopped once or twice, pausing to listen for the whispered words, which would guide him to Blakeney's hiding place. "Blakeney," he ventured to say at last cautiously, "Blakeney, are you there?" The next moment he rounded the rock against which Sir Percy and Marguerite were leaning, and seeing the weird figure still clad in the long Jew's gabardine, he paused in sudden, complete bewilderment. But already Blakeney had struggled to his feet. "Here I am, friend," he said with his funny, inane laugh, "all alive. Though I do look a begad scarecrow in these demmed things." "Zooks!" ejaculated Sir Andrew in boundless astonishment as he recognized his leader. "Of all the—" The young man had seen Marguerite, and happily checked the forcible language that rose to his lips, at sight of the exquisite Sir Percy in this weird and dirty garb. "Yes," said Blakeney calmly, "of all the— My friend, I have not yet had time to ask you what you were doing in France, when I ordered you to remain in London. Insubordination? What? Wait till my shoulders are less sore, and by gad, see the punishment you'll get." "Ott's fish." "I'll bear it," said Sir Andrew with a merry laugh, "seeing that you are alive to give it. Would you have had me allow Lady Blakeney to do the journey alone? But, in the name of heaven, man, where did you get these extraordinary clothes?" "Lot. They are a bit quaint, ain't they?" laughed Sir Percy jovially. "But Ott's fish," he added with sudden earnestness and authority, "now you are here, Fawkes, we must lose no more time, that brute Chauvelin may send someone to look after us. Marguerite was so happy she could have stayed here forever, hearing his voice, asking 100 questions. But at mention of Chauvelin's name she started in quick alarm, afraid for the dear life she would have died to save. "But how can we get back?" she gasped. "The roads are full of soldiers between here and Calais and—" "We are not going back to Calais, sweetheart," he said, "but just the other side of Grenez, not half a league from here. The boat of the Daydream will meet us there." "The boat of the Daydream?" "Yes," he said with a merry laugh, "another little trick of mine. I should have told you before that when I slipped that note into the hut, I also added another for Armand, which I directed him to leave behind, and which has sent Chauvelin and his men running full tilt back to the Chat Gris after me. But the first little note contained my real instructions, including those to old Briggs. He had my orders to go out further to sea and then towards the west. When well out of sight of Calais, he will send the galley to a little creek he and I know of, just beyond Grenez. The men will look out for me, we have a preconcerted signal, and we will all be safely aboard, whilst Chauvelin and his men solemnly sit and watch the creek which is just opposite the Chat Gris." "The other side of Grenez? But I cannot walk, Percy," she moaned helplessly as, trying to struggle to her tired feet, she found herself unable even to stand. "I will carry you, dear," he said simply, "the blind leading the lame, you know." Sir Andrew was ready too to help with the precious burden, but Sir Percy would not entrust his beloved to any arms but his own. "When you and she are both safely on board the Daydream," he said to his young comrade, "and I feel that Emily Suzanne's eyes will not greet me in England with reproachful looks, then it will be my turn to rest." And his arms, still vigorous in spite of fatigue and suffering, closed round Marguerite's poor weary body, and lifted her as gently as if she had been a feather. Then, as Sir Andrew discreetly kept out of earshot, there were many things said, or rather whispered, which even the autumn breeze did not catch, for it had gone to rest. All his fatigue was forgotten. His shoulders must have been very sore, for the soldiers had hit hard, but the man's muscles seemed made of steel, and his energy was almost supernatural. It was a weary tramp, half a league along the stony side of the cliffs, but never for a moment did his courage give way or his muscles yield to fatigue. On he tramped, with firm footstep, his vigorous arms encircling the precious burden, and, no doubt as she lay, quiet and happy, at times lulled to momentary drowsiness, at others watching, through the slowly gathering morning light, the pleasant face with the lazy, drooping blue eyes, ever cheerful, ever illumined with a good-humored smile, she whispered many things, which helped to shorten the weary road, and acted as a soothing balsam to his aching sinews. The many-hued light of dawn was breaking in the east, when at last they reached the creek beyond Grenez. The galley lay in wait. In answer to a signal from Sir Percy, she drew near, and 2 sturdy British sailors had the honor of carrying my lady into the boat. Half an hour later they were on board the Daydream. The crew, who of necessity were in their master's secrets, and who were devoted to him heart and soul, were not surprised to see him arriving in so extraordinary a disguise. Armand St. Just and the other fugitives were eagerly awaiting the advent of their brave rescuer. He would not stay to hear the expressions of their gratitude, but found his way to his private cabin as quickly as he could, leaving Marguerite quite happy in the arms of her brother. Everything on board the Daydream was fitted with that exquisite luxury, so dear to Sir Percy Blakeney's heart, and by the time they all landed at Dover he had found time to get into some of the sumptuous clothes which he loved, and of which he always kept a supply on board his yacht. The difficulty was to provide Marguerite with a pair of shoes, and great was the little middy's joy when my lady found that she could put foot on English shore in his best pair. The rest is silence. Silence and joy for those who had endured so much suffering, yet found at last a great and lasting happiness. But it is on record that at the brilliant wedding of Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, Bart., with Emily Suzanne de Tournay de Basserive, a function at which H. the Prince of Wales and all the elite of fashionable society were present, the most beautiful woman there was unquestionably Lady Blakeney, whilst the clothes Sir Percy Blakeney wore were the talk of the jeunesse dorée of London for many days. It is also a fact that M. Chauvelin, the accredited agent of the French Republican government, was not present at that or any other social function in London, after that memorable evening at Lord Grenville's ball. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook The Scarlet Pimpernel.